I remember the moment I decided to go to that cabin. I was tired of the noise and constant presence of people in the city. The air felt heavy, thick with dust and the smell of exhaust. I craved silence, the kind that wraps around you in a forest, the kind that makes your own breath sound loud. I found the cabin online, listed on a small rental site, the kind that only a few people knew about. It was remote, far from the nearest road, deep in the hills of northern woods. The pictures showed a small, sturdy wooden structure, surrounded by towering pines. The owner mentioned that it had no electricity, no Wi-Fi, and limited cell signal. That was exactly what I wanted. To be completely alone, to disconnect from everything, to hear nothing but wind in the trees. I packed carefully for the trip. I wanted to be self-sufficient. I brought a sleeping bag, food that didn't need refrigeration, water purification tablets, a small stove, and a few cans of beans and soup. I also packed a first aid kit, a heavy flashlight, extra batteries, a hatchet, and a small hunting knife. I didn't bring a gun because I wanted the trip to feel like a retreat, not a survivalist challenge. I thought about bears and wolves, but the area wasn't known for aggressive wildlife. Still, I took extra precautions. The drive was long, hours of winding roads, dirt paths, and the occasional passing truck. At some point, the asphalt ended, and I drove over a rough dirt trail that twisted through dense forest. My car rattled on the uneven path, rocks bouncing under the tires. I slowed down often, making sure not to hit anything. By the time I arrived, the sun was dipping low, turning the sky orange and casting long shadows through the trees. The cabin was exactly as pictured. Wooden walls, a stone chimney, a small porch with a wooden bench. It looked abandoned, quiet, and untouched. The forest around it was thick, almost suffocating in its density, with towering pines and dense underbrush that seemed to swallow the light. I stepped out and felt the air shift immediately. The smell of pine needles and damp earth hit me first. It was a sharp, clean scent, so different from the city, so different from my apartment where everything smelled of furniture polish and old carpet. I walked up to the cabin, my boots crunching on the dry leaves. I tested the door. It opened easily, the hinges slightly creaking, but functional. Inside, it smelled faintly of old wood, moss, and something else I couldn't identify, a faint metallic tang that I ignored. The floorboards were sturdy but uneven, warped slightly in some areas. The cabin had a small living area, a kitchenette with a sink and a wood-burning stove, a tiny bedroom with a single bed, and a bathroom with a cold water sink and an outdoor pit toilet. Everything was basic, functional, and silent. I set down my bag, took a deep breath, and walked through the cabin slowly. I opened the cupboards, checked the stove, and made sure everything worked. The wood for the fire was stacked neatly in the corner. I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. It was peaceful, too peaceful. The kind of silence that can make even the strongest people feel vulnerable if they are not careful. That first night, I lit a fire in the stove. The wood crackled, the flames throwing flickering shadows across the walls. I ate some canned beans heated in a small pot, feeling the warmth spread through me. Outside, the forest was dark, and I could hear the faint rustling of leaves and distant calls of birds settling in for the night. I slept uneasily, the kind of sleep where you wake every few hours, your senses heightened, your ears straining for the slightest sound. The next morning, I woke early, the cabin still quiet. I boiled water for coffee over the stove and sat on the porch, watching the sunlight cut through the trees. Everything looked calm, almost like a painting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching. I spent the day exploring nearby trails, carefully marking the path so I could find my way back. The forest was thick, dense, and full of life, but almost all of it was hidden. Occasionally, I would see a flash of movement, a deer, a rabbit, a fox perhaps, but most of the time, I was surrounded by stillness, broken only by the wind moving through the branches and the occasional creak of a tree. On the second night, I felt it first. A sound outside, not far from the cabin. A low, deliberate crunching of leaves. I froze, listening. The sound came again, slow, steady. Footsteps. Someone or something was walking near the cabin. My heart rate quickened. I checked the windows. They were small and I had locked the door. The sound stopped suddenly. I convinced myself it was a deer or a raccoon, anything but a person. But the forest around the cabin was thick. It would be impossible for a human to walk quietly without making more noise. I stayed up, sitting by the fire, listening to the darkness outside, the flashlight on the table beside me. Hours passed. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell asleep in a half-awake state, constantly imagining sounds in the dark. The third day, I noticed something strange. The path I had marked leading to the nearby stream was disturbed. Broken branches, footprints in the soft soil. I knew I hadn't been back that way yet. Whoever or whatever had been near the cabin had come close enough to leave traces. I felt a wave of fear, sharp and visceral, and I realized I wasn't fully alone in the forest. I packed my small bag, keeping my knife close, and walked to the stream to get water, my senses on high alert. The sun was high, and the forest looked different in daylight, more forgiving somehow, less threatening. But the feeling of being watched never left me. I returned to the cabin and decided to spend the rest of the day fortifying it. I placed heavy logs against the doors and checked all windows. I even took a length of rope and tied it across the cabin's front entrance as a precaution. That night, the sounds returned. Footsteps, now clearly human, circling the cabin. Slow, deliberate. I stayed in the shadows, clutching my knife, listening as the noise shifted, moving around the structure. It was close enough to see shadows through the cracks in the walls. Panic set in. I considered leaving immediately, but the forest was dark, and I had no clear way back on the rough trail in the night. I had to wait. Hours passed. The footsteps continued intermittently, never staying in one place for long. I remained hidden, silent, praying whoever it was would leave. By morning, the noises had stopped. In daylight, I could see the evidence clearly. Footprints in the dirt, fresh this time, larger than mine. Someone had been outside all night. I noticed other signs. Small items near the porch that had been moved. Rocks shifted. The rope I had tied was disturbed. I realized that it wasn't an animal. Someone had been observing the cabin, probably for days. The realization hit me hard. I was in real danger. I had to leave, but I couldn't risk walking the trail without preparation. I spent the day quietly packing, trying to move without leaving traces that someone could follow. I gathered my things, including the firewood, extra food, and water. I left the cabin appearing untouched, so the intruder would not know I had noticed them. I made sure my car was ready, tires checked, gas tank full. Then, I waited until dusk, timing my departure when shadows could conceal me, but not so late that I risked tripping over roots or getting lost. The journey back through the forest was tense. Every sound, every snap of a branch made my heart leap. I stayed low, moved quietly, and kept my flashlight off, relying on the last glimmers of daylight. The trail was rough, uneven, and sometimes overgrown, but I forced myself forward. I kept checking behind me, listening, scanning the shadows for signs of pursuit. Hours later, I saw the faint outline of the dirt road. Relief flooded through me. I ran the final stretch, my boots pounding the ground, until I reached my car. I didn't stop driving until I reached the highway, lights and civilization stretching endlessly in front of me. I never looked back. The memory of the footsteps, the deliberate circling, stayed with me for months. I realized how vulnerable I had been, alone in the forest with someone watching, waiting, possibly planning. I had been lucky. I never returned to that cabin. The idea of remote peace lost its appeal entirely. That experience taught me that isolation can be beautiful, but it can also be terrifying when it turns into a trap. Over time, I rebuilt my sense of safety slowly, taking short trips in less remote areas, always alert, always cautious. I learned to appreciate security, to value other people's presence, and to never underestimate the possibility of danger, even in the quietest, most beautiful places. The cabin remained empty, waiting, a reminder that silence and isolation can hide more than just peace. I had planned this trip for months, alone, to a cabin deep in the woods far from the city. I needed it more than I realized. Time away from people, from phones, from schedules, from the constant hum of life that never slowed down. The cabin wasn't far from the road, but it was tucked into a valley, hidden by thick pines and old maples. I drove up the gravel path late in the afternoon, and the sun was already dipping behind the hills, casting long shadows that stretched across the forest floor. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked smaller than I imagined. It was old but solid, built from heavy timber logs that had weathered decades of rain and snow. The porch creaked under my boots as I stepped out, my bag heavy on my shoulder, the air cold and sharp with the smell of pine needles and wet earth. I spent the first hour just walking around the property. There was a small stream nearby, barely more than a trickle, and a path leading further into the woods. I made mental notes of everything: the uneven stones leading to the porch, the rusty old swing hanging from a tree, the hollow sound of the floorboards inside the cabin. I unpacked quickly, lighting the stove to warm the place. The first night I stayed alert, listening to the wind brushing against the trees and the occasional snap of a twig in the distance. It wasn't threatening, just the sound of the forest, but my mind couldn't help filling in gaps. I realized I had not brought enough food for the week, only enough for 3 days, but I told myself I could hike down to the road and resupply if I needed. For the moment, I had enough firewood stacked near the door, and I could manage warmth. The second day I spent chopping wood and exploring. The cabin's condition was better than I expected: solid roof, functioning windows, stove that worked fine. The water pump outside gave me fresh water after a few tries. Still, I noticed a few things that didn't sit right. The locks on the door were old, and one of the windows didn't close fully. At first, I thought it was nothing, just the cabin being old, but then I noticed small footprints in the dirt near the back of the cabin. Not animal tracks, no, these were human-sized, but not deep enough to be a fully grown person. They led to the tree line and disappeared. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was probably a hiker or someone who had passed through days ago. Still, it left a strange feeling in my stomach. I decided to ignore it and spent the afternoon gathering firewood and hiking a little deeper into the woods, following deer tracks and photographing moss-covered rocks. By evening, I was exhausted, but the sky was clear, and the stars shone brighter than I had ever seen them in the city. The third day, things began to feel off. I woke to find the small stack of wood near the cabin door disturbed, as if someone had rifled through it. Some logs were moved, though not in a way consistent with wind or animals. My first reaction was anger. Maybe some local kids or hikers had decided to snoop, but there was no litter, no footprints beyond the edge of the cabin, nothing left behind. I brushed it off as paranoia, but I couldn't shake the uneasy sensation that I was being watched. I spent the morning checking the perimeter, noting every tree, every shadow, every potential hiding place. I locked the doors and windows more carefully, although I knew the locks were flimsy. I kept the stove going, and the cabin smelled of burning pine, warm and comforting. But outside the forest seemed endless, impenetrable, alive in a way that felt different than before. By evening, I was tense, ears straining at every sound, heart jumping at the slightest rustle. I told myself to calm down, to breathe, that I was fine. On the fourth day, the situation escalated. I had gone out to explore a ridge overlooking the cabin, hoping the distance would help me clear my mind. From the ridge, the cabin looked isolated, entirely swallowed by the trees, a lone square of brown in an ocean of green. When I returned, I found the front door slightly ajar. I was certain I had locked it. My stomach dropped. I stepped inside cautiously, checking every corner. Nothing appeared stolen. Nothing moved except the log pile, which had been shifted again. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the pattern was unmistakable. Someone had been there. I didn't see anyone, and no footprints were visible in the damp earth around the porch, not even a trail leading away. I began to consider the possibility that someone was observing me from the woods, just waiting, careful not to be seen. Sleep became impossible that night. I stacked furniture near the doors and windows, trying to create barriers, but my imagination was relentless. Every shadow outside the window was a potential intruder. Every wind gust a threat. I felt my nerves fraying. The fifth day brought rain. Thick, steady rain that filled the air with the smell of wet leaves and mud. The forest seemed quieter, muffled, almost holding its breath. I stayed in the cabin all day, checking the woodpile constantly and keeping the fire going. Then I heard it, a faint tapping, like a branch hitting a window, slow and deliberate. It wasn't the wind. My first thought was an animal, a raccoon or a bird, but the pattern repeated in a way that suggested intention. My mind screamed at me to ignore it, but I couldn't. I spent hours staring out the windows, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever it was. Finally, the tapping stopped. I told myself it was nothing, that I was exhausted and imagining things, but deep down I knew it wasn't a dream. That night, I slept lightly, waking at every sound, clutching a heavy stick I found in the shed. By the sixth day, I was exhausted, tense, and hungry. I had barely eaten, mostly toast and canned goods. The sense of being watched had become almost unbearable. I decided I couldn't stay in the cabin anymore. I packed my bag to hike back to the main road. As I stepped outside, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Tracks, clear human tracks, circled the cabin, appearing as though someone had walked around it multiple times, careful to avoid making noise. They weren't old. The mud was still wet. There was no way they could have appeared overnight without someone being there. I realized with horror that someone had been following me, lurking nearby, watching every movement I made. I debated running, but the forest was thick, the rain making the ground slippery and treacherous. Every step outside felt dangerous. I had no weapon, no backup, only a pack and the instinct to survive. I decided to wait until dusk, hoping the rain would hide my movements and the intruder would be distracted. I carefully loaded my bag, keeping my eyes on the tree line. I kept imagining the person stepping from the shadows, catching me unprepared, but nothing happened. The forest was quiet, oppressive, tense, like a held breath. At last, I began my walk down the narrow path that led to the road, each step slow and careful, listening to every sound. The path was muddy, the undergrowth slick, and I stumbled more than once, my heart racing. I glanced back constantly, half expecting to see a figure following. None appeared. The walk took longer than I expected, the forest closing around me, branches scraping my coat, roots tripping me up. I moved slowly, methodically, imagining the worst and preparing for it. Hours later, I finally broke through the edge of the forest onto the gravel road. A car passed slowly, headlights cutting through the gloom. I waved frantically, grateful for the sight of another human being. The driver slowed, looked at me with curiosity and concern, and I explained in short, disjointed sentences that someone had been near my cabin, that I was alone, that I needed help. They offered to drive me into town, and I accepted immediately. As the car pulled away, I looked back toward the forest. The cabin was just visible through the trees, silent, alone, the rain running down its walls. I felt a strange mixture of relief and lingering fear, the knowledge that someone had been there watching, but no clear indication of who or why. The forest remained quiet behind me, hiding secrets I would never know. The days after that, I didn't return to the cabin. I spoke to the local authorities who found nothing unusual, no signs of forced entry, no tracks other than mine. They suggested it might have been squatters or curious hikers, but the feeling of being followed was too real to dismiss. I moved on, eventually, carrying with me a heightened awareness, a caution I had never felt before, and a story that would haunt me in the quiet moments of the night. The cabin remained there, untouched, a reminder that even in isolation, one is not always truly alone. And though the ending of my ordeal was clear, I had survived, escaped, and returned to safety. The forest retained its mystery, the fear it instilled both real and lingering, a mark on my life that would never fade. I remember the drive clearly, though it was nearly 10 years ago. I had been craving a break from the city for weeks, exhausted by the constant noise, the lights, the people always in a rush. I had found a cabin online, a simple listing tucked away deep in the woods, far from any town, where the road ended and only dirt trails continued. It seemed perfect, isolated, quiet, a place to just be alone and breathe. The pictures were modest but promising. A small log cabin with a stone chimney, a wooden deck overlooking a shallow creek, and enough space to feel like the world had disappeared. I arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun began to tilt low between the trees. The air smelled different immediately, thicker with the scent of wet earth and pine, a little like the inside of a forest after a rain. There were no neighbors, no cars, just the sound of my tires crunching on the gravel and the occasional distant bird call. I parked and got out, stretching my legs. The cabin looked smaller in real life, the logs worn and darkened with age, but it had character. I felt a slight shiver, not from fear, but from the sheer stillness around me. The first thing I noticed inside was the smell, a mixture of wood smoke, dust, and the faint musk of long-closed rooms. The place had clearly been empty for a while. Sunlight filtered through thin curtains, highlighting motes of dust in the air. I walked through each room slowly, noticing the small details. Scratches on the floorboards, a faint stain on the corner of a rug, cobwebs in the corners of the ceiling. The cabin was functional, with a small kitchen, a living area, a bedroom with a creaky bed, and a bathroom that smelled faintly of mildew. I unpacked my bag, set my things down, and decided to explore the surrounding land before night fell completely. The backyard led straight into the forest, a tangle of old trees, fallen logs, and underbrush. The creek ran along the side of the property, murmuring quietly over stones. I followed it upstream, feeling the solitude wrap around me like a thick blanket. After a few hours, the sun sank lower, and the forest darkened in a way that made every rustle and snap of a branch feel amplified. Birds had stopped singing, and an occasional squirrel dashed across my path, eyes wide, muscles taut. I turned back toward the cabin as the first hints of twilight came through, eager to be inside with a fire lit and the door locked behind me. Inside, I started a small fire in the stone fireplace. The flame cast shadows that danced across the walls, making the cabin feel alive in a strange way. I ate a simple dinner, washed the few dishes I had brought, and settled into the living room with a blanket. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and shaking the trees, creating strange patterns of light and shadow. I told myself it was just the wind, just the trees, but a small part of me remained on edge. The deeper the forest, the quieter it becomes, and in that quiet, the imagination runs wild. I had planned to go to bed early, but sleep did not come easily. Around midnight, I heard it, a faint sound outside, like someone or something moving carefully through the underbrush. My first thought was a deer or a raccoon, but the sound had a rhythm, almost deliberate. I froze, listening. Footsteps? Not exactly. More like the brush being pushed aside, slowly, cautiously. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. I had been alone in the woods before, and I knew animals made all kinds of noises at night. But there was something about this that made my stomach tighten, a subtle sense of being watched. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the door, peeking out into the dark. The porch was empty. The woods stood still, black and thick, with only the creek glimmering faintly in the moonlight. I scanned the trees, the shadows, the edge of the creek. Nothing. I told myself to stop being paranoid. I closed the door, bolted it, and returned to the fire, sitting as close to it as I could. Every now and then, I thought I heard something at the edge of the property. A snap of a branch, a rustle, then silence. I kept imagining movement, shadows twisting between the trees, something inching closer. By the third night, the feeling had not gone away. If anything, it had grown worse. The isolation was total. The nearest neighbor lived miles away, and I had no cell service in most areas of the property. I realized I had underestimated the impact of being truly alone. The silence outside was oppressive, pressing against the walls of the cabin, making every small sound inside seem enormous. One night, I woke to a sudden noise, a loud, deliberate knock on the door. My heart stopped. I told myself it must be a branch or the wind, but the sound had been too precise, too forceful. I sat in the dark for what felt like an hour, holding a kitchen knife in my hand, listening. Nothing followed. No more knocks, no footsteps, just the creak murmuring softly in the distance. I became hyper-aware of every sound. The creaking of the floorboards, the groan of the walls as they settled, the rustling outside. I started sleeping in short bursts, waking frequently, checking the locks, peering into the darkness. The days blended together in an uneasy rhythm. Daylight hours of cautious exploration and work around the cabin, nighttime hours of tense vigilance. I started keeping a small pile of stones next to the door in case I needed to defend myself. I thought about leaving, but there was no road for miles, and the idea of navigating that in the dark felt worse than staying put. On the fourth night, the sounds became closer, more deliberate. Branches snapped almost rhythmically, footsteps crunching over the forest floor. I could hear something or someone moving along the edge of the property, circling the cabin. I did not leave the living room that night. I sat by the fire, holding the knife, every sense tuned to the darkness outside. The wind had stopped, leaving the forest almost unnervingly still. Hours passed. I was exhausted, eyes burning, but I could not sleep. Every creak in the cabin, every small pop from the settling wood, made me jump. I began to notice patterns. The sounds would come at roughly the same time each night, always circling, always stopping just short of the porch. It was deliberate. Someone was out there watching, testing the cabin, testing me. Fear replaced any sense of isolation as a peaceful retreat. I realized I had misjudged how vulnerable I truly was. Alone in a small, exposed cabin with no one around for miles. My imagination had moved beyond simple fear. It was a detailed anticipation of every possible threat. On the fifth night, I made a plan. I would not wait for them to come closer. I gathered all the tools and supplies I could. An axe from the shed, the knife from the kitchen, a crowbar, a few heavy objects to throw if necessary. I fortified the cabin as best as I could. I checked the locks, wedged the doors with heavy furniture, even placed stones on the windowsills to prevent easy entry. I also prepared an escape route, a small path through the back of the property leading to a secondary road I had discovered on my initial exploration. It was risky, but I realized that if someone or something actually attempted to break in, I had to be ready. Night fell and the sounds began again. This time I was ready. I could hear precise movements along the edge of the trees, circling the cabin, stopping abruptly, starting again. My nerves were taut, every muscle ready. Hours passed with no direct confrontation, but the tension was unbearable. At one point, I saw a shadow flick across the window, sharp and fleeting. My heart raced. I gripped the axe, staring into the darkness, waiting. Eventually, exhaustion overcame adrenaline, and I dozed off, leaning against the door, the axe in my lap. Morning brought relief. The forest was quiet, the previous night's sounds gone, replaced by ordinary birdsong. I stepped outside, inspecting the perimeter. There were footprints, small, deliberate, circling the cabin. Not animal tracks, human. I traced them slowly, feeling a mix of terror and anger. Whoever had been there had been testing me, observing. I took photos of the tracks with my old camera, then packed up quickly, deciding to leave for the nearest town. On the drive back, I thought about what had happened. The experience had changed me. I realized how easily isolation could make you vulnerable, how quickly fear could take over your mind. But I also felt a strange sense of accomplishment. I had survived, stayed alert, and left unharmed. The cabin had been intimidating, frightening, but in the end, the threat had been manageable because I stayed calm, observed, and prepared. I never returned to that cabin, and I never sought out that kind of isolation again. But the memory stayed with me, vivid and sharp, a reminder of how small and exposed we can be in the wilderness, and how quickly a peaceful retreat can turn into something much darker. Even now, I remember the smell of the forest after rain, the way the shadows shifted in the firelight, the precise sound of footsteps circling in the dark. It was real. It was terrifying. and I survived. I had been driving all day, the roads twisting and turning through the dense forested hills, my mind half on the route, half on the thought of getting away from everything for a while. I had planned this cabin trip for weeks, ever since the stress at work had built into something unbearable. I needed isolation, a chance to breathe without the constant hum of phones, emails, and the endless pressure that never seemed to let up. The GPS had lost signal hours back, and I was relying on an old printed map I had found in a drawer, a paper one that was curled and worn at the edges. I had picked this cabin because it was far enough off the beaten path that few, if any, would be around. I wanted silence, and I wanted nothing else. The cabin was smaller than I had imagined. A simple wooden structure with a steeply pitched roof, and a small porch overlooking a clearing that fell into thick woods. It looked abandoned at first glance. Weathered, the paint chipped, the steps slightly warped, but it was structurally sound. I parked my car on the dirt driveway, feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension as I stepped out. The air was thick with the scent of pine, damp earth, and something faintly metallic that I could not place. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the forest. I had brought supplies: canned food, a few packs of ramen, bottled water, and a small camping stove. There were blankets, extra clothing, and even a small first aid kit. I had prepared for solitude, but I hadn't prepared for the way the silence would settle over me once I was inside. The cabin was simple but livable. A small living space with a wood stove, a kitchenette with a rusty sink and cupboards filled with dusty dishes, and a tiny bedroom in the back. The furniture was sparse, mostly a couple of chairs, a small table, and a rickety bed frame with a thin mattress. I unpacked what I had brought, stacked firewood next to the stove, and lit a small fire. The first flames were uneven, smoke curling through the metal chimney, but soon the room warmed, and the cabin felt less like a shell and more like a temporary sanctuary. The first night, I barely slept. I was too aware of every creak of the wooden floorboards, every gust of wind that rattled the windows. The forest seemed alive with sound. Branches snapping under some invisible weight, rustling leaves, and distant calls that I couldn't place. It wasn't the kind of fear born of imagination, though. It was the awareness of being entirely alone, far from anyone who could help. Still, the warmth of the fire and the familiarity of my sleeping bag kept me from panicking. Morning brought some relief. Sunlight poured through the windows, bright and sharp, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. I prepared a simple breakfast, brewed some instant coffee, and sat by the window, watching the forest. Everything seemed normal, almost soothing. I told myself that the noises of the previous night had been the wind, the small animals moving through the undergrowth, and my own mind exaggerating the smallest disturbances. That afternoon, I decided to explore the surrounding woods. I had a backpack with some essentials: water, snacks, a flashlight, and a basic pocket knife. The trees were dense, the underbrush thick and uneven, but the sunlight made the forest seem almost friendly. I followed an old, barely visible trail, enjoying the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the occasional glimpse of a bird or squirrel. After an hour, I came to a small stream, the water clear and cold, trickling over rocks. I knelt to drink some, feeling the chill of the water on my hands, and then sat back on a rock to rest. It was there, as I sat, that I first noticed the signs. At first, it was subtle: footprints in the soft mud along the edge of the stream. They weren't human. They were too large and too heavy, with a rounded shape that pressed deep into the soil. I had seen deer tracks before, but these were different, heavier, and spaced strangely. My stomach tightened. I glanced around, trying to dismiss it, telling myself it must be a bear or another large animal. I had been careful to bring bear spray, but the thought of an encounter in such isolation made my heart race. I stood and slowly made my way back to the cabin, keeping my eyes on the ground and scanning the trees. When I arrived, everything seemed as it had been. The cabin, quiet and still, almost comforting in its simplicity. I locked the door and sat by the fire, trying to calm myself. But as evening approached, I began to notice small things. signs that I wasn't as alone as I thought. The first was the sound of movement outside. At first, I dismissed it as a deer or some other forest creature, but the timing was off. It was deliberate, almost too rhythmic to be random. Something was moving around the cabin, circling. I was sure. I checked the windows, peering out into the dimming light, but saw nothing. The forest swallowed everything in darkness, and soon I could hear nothing but my own breathing and the occasional crack of the fire. That night, sleep did not come. Every shadow in the cabin seemed alive. The creaking floorboards echoed too loudly in my mind. I could hear the wind outside, but there was something else, something heavier, moving with purpose. I stayed awake, clutching the knife in my hand, ears straining, eyes fixed on the doorway. Hours passed. I don't know if I dozed at all, but when the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I was exhausted, trembling from adrenaline and cold. The next day, I decided I could not stay passive. I needed to investigate the signs around the cabin to understand if the threat was human or animal. I armed myself with my knife and a heavy stick, moving carefully through the undergrowth around the cabin. That's when I found it. A shallow trench dug near the back of the cabin, disturbed soil and broken branches marking it clearly. Something or someone had been watching, preparing. I felt the fear settle deep in my chest, but I also felt clarity. I had to stay vigilant. Over the next days, I kept watch. I set makeshift alarms using cans and string, creating a perimeter that would alert me if anything approached. I fortified the cabin as best as I could, moving furniture to block easy access points and checking the windows. Every night, the noises returned. Scraping, thumping, the unmistakable sound of movement outside. But no one ever revealed themselves. It was as if whoever or whatever was out there was testing me. Waiting, I rationed my food carefully, conserving my energy. I spent the days gathering water, maintaining the fire, and patrolling the perimeter. The isolation weighed on me, but I refused to give in to panic. I reminded myself that fear could make mistakes more dangerous than any real threat. One night, I found deep scratches on the door frame, the wood gouged as though someone had tried to force their way in. My heart pounded, but I stayed calm, reinforcing the door with the thickest pieces of furniture I could move. On the fifth night, the encounter came. I had been watching through the window when I saw movement. Larger than before, deliberate. A human silhouette, obscured by the shadows of the trees, creeping toward the cabin. My hands gripped the knife and the stick simultaneously. I could see the glint of a metal object in their hand. I froze, waiting, heart hammering. The figure stopped, crouched, then moved slowly along the side of the cabin. I realized then that it had been observing me, knowing my routines. I had no choice but to act. I opened the door quietly and stepped outside, forcing myself to appear larger, more imposing. The figure froze, and I swung the stick in a wide arc, shouting as loudly as I could. It worked. The figure bolted into the trees, disappearing instantly. I chased for a moment, but the dense forest swallowed them. My adrenaline surged, but so did relief. I had survived and they had fled. The next morning, I didn't wait. I packed my belongings, double-checked the cabin, and left as quickly as possible. I drove through the winding roads without stopping, not trusting the forest to remain empty behind me. When I finally reached the main road and saw another car, another person, I felt a sense of safety I hadn't known in days. The isolation that I had sought had turned into a dangerous game, one I was lucky to escape. Looking back, the experience was harrowing, but it taught me something essential. Survival in isolation depends on awareness, preparation, and courage. The cabin had been just a structure, the forest just trees, but the reality of being vulnerable alone in the wilderness was far more terrifying than anything I could imagine. And though I escaped physically unharmed, the memory of those nights, the scratches on the door, and the sense of being watched will remain with me forever. I never returned to that cabin, and I never sought isolation in such remote places again. Some places, I realized, are best left alone, no matter how tempting the idea of solitude may be. I had been planning the cabin trip for months. It wasn't the kind of vacation I normally took, but after the year I had gone through, I needed isolation more than anything. The kind of isolation that only a cabin in the deep woods could provide, where no one could reach me unless they were deliberately searching, where no one could intrude, where I could disappear for a few days and feel completely untethered. I had found a small, rented cabin through an online listing. It was remote, described as off the grid, far from any town, with only a dirt road leading to it. I liked that. I liked the thought of being alone with nature, far from people, far from traffic, far from anything that reminded me of my life in the city. I drove for hours, longer than I had expected, through winding, narrow roads that seemed to get narrower the further I went. The trees grew taller, denser, shading the road in a green twilight even though it was mid-afternoon. My phone's signal disappeared long before I reached the cabin, and I realized I hadn't checked my fuel tank. The gas light had flickered on a couple of times, but I had assumed I had a little time. By the time I reached the small clearing where the cabin sat, the sun was low, the shadows long, and I was already anxious that I might have misjudged the fuel. The cabin itself was small, wooden, sturdy-looking but old. There was a small porch, a stack of firewood to the side, and a faint trail leading down to what appeared to be a small creek. It looked perfect, exactly what I had imagined. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of damp wood and old smoke. There was a small kitchen, a living area with a wood-burning stove, a bedroom, and a tiny bathroom. It had the basics: a bed, a few chairs, some pots and pans, a kettle, and even a small supply of firewood stacked neatly in a corner. Nothing fancy, nothing modern beyond a couple of solar-powered lights and a lantern. I unpacked my bag slowly, intentionally. I wanted to take it all in, to appreciate the quiet, the solitude. I lit the stove, checked the firewood, and poured myself a small bottle of water. I was tired but content. The first night passed without incident, though it was colder than I expected. The wind outside was sharp, pushing through the trees and making the cabin creak in ways that made my stomach tighten a little. But I told myself it was normal. Old cabins did that. The first morning was beautiful. The sunlight broke through the trees and dappled the floorboards. The creek gurgled softly in the distance, and I felt a calm I hadn't felt in months. I spent the day walking the nearby trail, taking pictures of the small birds, the moss on the trees, and the way the sun lit patches of the forest floor. The isolation felt therapeutic, almost like a balm on my frayed nerves. It was on the second night that I started noticing odd things. At first, it was small and easy to rationalize. The back door, which I was certain I had locked, seemed slightly ajar. I could hear faint noises outside, like twigs snapping, but there was no wind, and I didn't see any animals on the trail. I chalked it up to my imagination or fatigue. The isolation, I thought, was already playing tricks on me. But then, I began noticing patterns. Food from the small stockpile in the cabin seemed to shift slightly. A can of beans I had placed in one spot was in another. A small chair in the corner of the living room wasn't exactly where I had left it. I started leaving little marks on objects to test if they were being moved, and each morning they had changed. My stomach started tightening. I wasn't imagining it. Someone or something had been in the cabin. The thought was terrifying because the cabin was so remote. There was no way anyone had stumbled across it by accident. No one could reach it without intending to, and that meant I wasn't alone. The next day, I stayed inside mostly. I made sure the doors were locked, stacked the firewood near the door for some kind of barrier, and moved the bed slightly in case someone tried to enter through the windows. The sunlight in the cabin felt less comforting now. Shadows in the corners seemed darker, the creaks of the wood louder, more sinister. I tried to rationalize again. Maybe it was a raccoon or a deer, but the movements of my supplies, the chair, the small things made that impossible. No animal would do that. That night, I barely slept. Every noise made me startle. Every shadow seemed like a person moving. I heard the creak of the floorboards upstairs, though the cabin only had one level. My pulse raced constantly. I felt trapped in a place that should have felt safe. And then I heard something worse. A faint tapping, slow and deliberate, coming from outside the window. Not random, not like a branch in the wind. Someone was out there. I froze. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I considered calling the police, but my phone had no signal. I considered leaving, but the road back was long, winding, and dark. And if someone was watching me, they would know I was trying to leave. I felt trapped. I stayed in the bedroom, holding a heavy cast iron skillet I had found in the kitchen. The tapping continued, sometimes moving around the cabin, sometimes directly against the walls. Hours passed. Couldn't sleep. I couldn't even relax enough to sit down. The entire night passed in a tense, horrible blur. When dawn finally broke, the tapping stopped. The forest outside looked calm, normal, as if nothing had happened. I spent the day checking the cabin for signs of forced entry. Windows were locked, doors were secure. There were no footprints outside, no signs that someone had been creeping around. And yet, every night the tapping returned, the movement of objects, the sense that I was being watched. I started barricading the windows with firewood, placing chairs against doors, and sleeping fully dressed, ready to run. By the fourth night, exhaustion had taken over. I was barely functioning. My hands shook constantly. I could barely focus on simple tasks. I realized I had to do something. I couldn't just sit and wait for someone to break in and potentially hurt me. I decided to prepare for an encounter, to defend myself if necessary. I gathered tools, made improvised weapons from kitchen knives, hammers, and heavy objects. I set up a perimeter in the cabin with obstacles, moved furniture to create barriers, and even poured some water in trays along the floor in case someone tried to sneak in. They would leave footprints, I reasoned, giving me warning. The fifth night was worse. The tapping became louder, more persistent, almost mocking. It moved from window to window, wall to wall. I could hear it above the sound of the wind and the creek. I could feel it in my chest, a tight, suffocating fear. I thought about screaming, but there was no one to hear me. No one could hear me in these woods. And that's when I heard it, the first step inside. A soft, careful footstep on the wooden floor. My heart stopped. I gripped the skillet so tightly my knuckles turned white. I waited. The step came again, closer, deliberate. I could feel the presence moving in the cabin, around me, like a shadow. And then a crash. The chair I had barricaded the door with had been pushed over. My pulse exploded. I swung the skillet blindly at the sound, yelling even though no one would hear. The next moments were a blur. I could hear the sound of objects falling, wood cracking, and then silence. I didn't move for a long time. My body shook uncontrollably. I didn't hear any more footsteps. I didn't hear the tapping. I didn't hear the wind or the creek. Everything was quiet, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I stayed in the corner of the bedroom until the sun came up, watching, waiting. When morning arrived, I cautiously left the bedroom. Nothing seemed out of place at first, but then I saw it. A faint smear on the window, like someone had pressed their hand against the glass. There were no other signs of forced entry. Whoever had come in had left no footprints, no obvious clues, just that faint mark. I realized the danger wasn't over, and it might never truly end while I stayed there. I spent the next day preparing my escape. I filled my car with gas from the small container I had bought in case of emergencies, packed my bag quickly, and made sure everything was ready. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the corner of the living room, surrounded by makeshift weapons, waiting for the first sign of movement. The tapping didn't come. No footsteps, no sounds. I realized whoever it was had likely left, or maybe they were waiting, watching, and I would never know. First light, I left. I didn't even lock the cabin properly. I ran down the dirt road, my bag on my back, my eyes constantly scanning the tree line. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump, but I kept moving. Hours later, I reached a paved road, and finally, cell service returned. I called the police, reported the break-in, though I had no proof beyond the small handprint. They said they would send someone, but I didn't wait. I needed to get home. The experience stayed with me long after I left the cabin. I moved apartments, changed my routine, and never went back to the woods. I kept the skillet, the one I had clutched during those nights, on a high shelf, a reminder of how fragile safety can be, how quickly solitude can turn into terror. I learned to trust my instincts more, to prepare for the worst even when the world seemed calm. And I never, ever underestimated how truly vulnerable I could be when I was alone. It took months before I felt comfortable sleeping through the night without waking at the smallest sound. Even now, years later, I find myself thinking about that cabin, the darkness, the tapping, the feeling of being watched. I know I was lucky to get out, lucky that whatever it was never decided to be more aggressive. But that trip changed me in ways I didn't anticipate. I learned that fear can be real, can exist without explanation, can inhabit the quiet spaces in life where we think we are safe. And that lesson, though terrifying, has kept me alive. I had been looking forward to a solo trip into the mountains for months. I needed time alone, away from the constant noise of the city, the relentless pull of screens, messages, emails, and the weight of expectations. I wanted quiet, isolation, and something raw, something that would strip life down to its most basic elements. That's why I rented the cabin deep in the national forest. It wasn't fancy. It was small, wooden, built probably decades ago, and the photos online made it look like a dream. Surrounded by pine trees and backed by a cliffside, it promised solitude and peace. At least, that's what I thought when I drove up that winding, gravel road. The journey there was long, the kind where the phone loses signal and even the faintest internet disappears, leaving only the sound of the tires on the gravel and the occasional call of a bird. The last stretch was barely wide enough for one car. The trees leaned inward like they were closing the road off from the rest of the world. When I finally arrived, the sun was low, casting long shadows that slanted across the small clearing where the cabin sat. The building was weathered but solid, the wood darkened with age, some planks warped slightly, others scarred from storms past. The windows were old but clean, and the front porch sagged a little on one side, as if it had seen many years of rain, snow, and sun. I parked, unloaded my bag, and looked around. The forest was dense, thick with undergrowth. The air smelled like pine and wet soil. There was a river nearby, or maybe it was just a stream, its sound faint but constant in the background, hidden by the trees. Birds darted from branch to branch, and a few squirrels scurried along the ground. I felt good, like I had stepped into a different world, a quiet one where nothing but time existed. The cabin door opened with a low creak. Inside, it was sparse but functional. A small kitchen area with a stove and a sink, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a bed pushed against the far wall, and a wood-burning stove that looked like it hadn't been used in a while. Dust lay in the corners, but it wasn't dirty. I unpacked, set my bag on the bed, and opened the windows to let in the cool, fresh mountain air. As night approached, I lit a small fire in the stove. The cabin filled with warmth and a golden glow. I ate a simple meal I had packed and then sat by the window, watching as darkness slowly swallowed the forest. First, it was beautiful. The shadows stretched, and the wind whispered through the trees. But as the night deepened, the quiet started to feel heavy. Not oppressive, but deliberate, as if it had weight. I had expected silence, but I hadn't expected how alive it could feel. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sounded amplified in the darkness. Around midnight, I noticed something strange. The sound of footsteps, or maybe it was dragging, outside. At first, I thought it was an animal. Bears were common in these woods, and deer wandered close to cabins in the early mornings and evenings. But the sound was too measured, too deliberate, heavy, slow. Not a deer or a bear. I froze, listening, my stomach twisting. The sound moved around the cabin, circling, stopping, starting again. I checked the locks. Door was secure. Windows were shut tight. No one could get in. I decided to wait it out, thinking it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or some other nocturnal creature. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the darkness outside. Nothing. The beam cut through the trees, revealing nothing but shadows, trunks, and leaves. I walked around the perimeter of the cabin, shining the light into every corner. Nothing. Not a sign of life. Not a footprint, not a shape. Just shadows. I tried to shake it off, telling myself the wind was moving branches, that my mind was playing tricks in the dark. But the feeling didn't leave. My pulse thumped in my ears as I tried to focus on the fire, on the warmth, on anything that would remind me I was safe. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I lay down in bed, listening to the occasional rustle outside. I drifted in and out of sleep, but my dreams were restless, filled with the sound of footsteps circling, dragging, whispering in shapes I couldn't see. Morning came with gray light, thick and muted. I got up slowly, my body tense, eyes scanning every corner of the room. Outside, everything seemed normal. The trees swayed gently, birds called, the air smelled of wet leaves and pine. Nothing seemed out of place. I told myself I had imagined it. I had been tense and alone. Maybe it was just nerves. I decided to wait it out, thinking it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or some other nocturnal creature. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the darkness outside. Nothing. The beam cut through the trees, revealing nothing but shadows, trunks, and leaves. I walked around the perimeter of the cabin, shining the light into every corner. Nothing. Not a sign of life. Not a footprint, not a shape. Just shadows. I tried to shake it off, telling myself the wind was moving branches, that my mind was playing tricks in the dark. But the feeling didn't leave. My pulse thumped in my ears as I tried to focus on the fire, on the warmth, on anything that would remind me I was safe. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I lay down in bed, listening to the occasional rustle outside. I drifted in and out of sleep, but my dreams were restless, filled with the sound of footsteps circling, dragging, whispering in shapes I couldn't see. Morning came with gray light, thick and muted. I got up slowly, my body tense, eyes scanning every corner of the room. Outside, everything seemed normal. The trees swayed gently, birds called, the air smelled of wet leaves and pine. Nothing seemed out of place. I told myself I had imagined it. I had been tense and alone. Maybe it was just nerves. I decided to hike to the river, something to clear my head, get fresh air, and calm my thoughts. The trail was narrow, barely marked, overgrown in places. The forest closed in as I walked, sunlight filtering through the leaves, creating dancing patches on the ground. The air was damp, earthy, and cold. I found the river, a small, fast-moving stream, water rushing over rocks. I sat on a rock, listening to the sound, watching the ripples and currents. The day was quiet, peaceful even. I returned to the cabin mid-afternoon. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. One of the cabin windows, the one facing the back, towards the dense trees, was slightly ajar. Not fully open, just a crack, barely noticeable, but enough that it shouldn't have been. I was sure I had closed it the night before. My mind raced. Could the wind have done it? Possible, but unlikely. I remembered locking it, checking all the latches. I touched the latch. Cold metal. Tight. Not broken. Someone had opened it. Panic rose. My first thought was a break-in. I grabbed a kitchen knife and went through the cabin, checking every corner. Doors locked, windows closed except for that one. Nothing inside was disturbed. No footprints on the floor, no items moved. My bag was untouched. Still, the feeling of being watched was heavy, pressing down on my chest. I spent the night on high alert, fire burning brightly, knife beside me, eyes darting to every shadow. Outside, I heard the rustling again, faint but deliberate, moving around the cabin. I stayed awake, barely blinking, till the first light of dawn. The next day, I debated leaving. Part of me wanted to pack and drive out immediately, but another part wanted to understand. I wanted answers. I couldn't ignore that something had been there. I went on a longer hike, taking the forest paths deeper, noting every broken branch, every footprint. Some were animal tracks, yes, deer, raccoon, maybe even a bear. But others, some were human. Clear, booted footprints, leading in and out of the dense undergrowth near the cabin. They were fresh, recent. My stomach sank. Back at the cabin, I fortified it. I placed heavy furniture against the doors, made sure all the windows were locked, checked the latches twice. I considered calling for help, but no signal. No way to get word out except by driving back down the mountain, and I was committed to staying. At least I told myself I would be more prepared tonight. That night I heard them again. Footsteps, scraping, slow, deliberate. I stayed inside the cabin, flashlight and knife ready. The sound circled, stopped, started again. Then, the most unnerving sound. A light knock at the door. Not hard, not frantic, but measured. Calm, controlled. Whoever it was, they knew I was inside. I held my breath, pressed against the wall, counting every second. The knock came again, and then again. No words, no demands, just 3 measured taps. I didn't answer. I stayed still, heart hammering. Hours passed like that. Morning brought relief. The knocking had stopped. Footsteps gone. I rushed outside. There were footprints all around the cabin, human, heavy boots, some circling, some leading into the trees. Whoever had been here had left. Maybe they were watching, maybe they were testing. Couldn't know. I decided then that I would leave, but I had to take care of something first. I packed everything, moved as quickly and quietly as possible. Then, before leaving, I walked the perimeter one last time. That's when I noticed something small, barely visible. A metal trinket, old, lying in the dirt by the back window. A charm or medallion of some kind, weathered. It didn't belong to me. Someone had been inside, close enough to leave something behind. The realization hit me. I had been inside their territory, and they had come close enough to see me sleeping. My blood ran cold again, but I stayed calm. I picked it up, shoved it into my bag. Evidence. A warning. The drive down the mountain was tense. Every turn, every bend, I scanned the tree line. Nothing followed. Nothing moved. The forest fell behind, and the first cell signal came through. I called the authorities immediately, reporting the break-in, the footprints, the trinket. They told me they would investigate, that I should stay somewhere safe. I drove straight to the nearest town, heart still pounding, hands shaking. Weeks later, I learned that the area around that cabin had been the site of multiple crimes over the years. Squatters, people hiding from the law, and occasional violent encounters. They were careful, knew the terrain, and often left little evidence behind. What I had experienced was terrifying because it was deliberate, controlled, and close. But I had survived. I had noticed, I had documented, I had left intact. That cabin, for me, was a reminder of how fragile solitude can be, how quickly isolation can turn into danger when you are in someone else's territory. I never went back. The cabin, the forest, the creek, they remained beautiful, but forever marked in my mind by the fear of being watched, by the weight of knowing someone had been inside my temporary home. But I was alive. I learned to pay attention to signs, to trust instincts, and to respect the unseen patterns of the world. That trip, that experience changed me. I wasn't broken by fear. I was sharpened by it, reminded that being alone doesn't mean being safe, but it can teach you vigilance, awareness, and respect for the unknown limits of isolation. I had been planning the trip for months. The idea of leaving behind the constant noise of the city, the phones, the endless traffic, and the crowded streets had taken over every thought I had in the weeks before I finally drove out to the cabin. It was supposed to be a simple retreat. A few days alone in a small wooden cabin deep in the woods, somewhere far from anyone else. The place was remote, reachable only by a long, winding dirt road that twisted through dense pine forests. On the map, the cabin looked isolated, almost forgotten, and that's what had drawn me to it. I wanted silence, solitude, and the chance to feel like I was truly alone. I didn't realize just how alone I would be until I got there. The drive itself had been long and tiring, more than I expected. My car bounced along uneven paths, small rocks crunching under the tires, and I had to stop more than once to check the map, to make sure I wasn't going too far off track. There were signs of other people in the beginning. Old cottages, small farms, abandoned sheds. But as I drove deeper into the forest, they disappeared completely. Even the birds seemed quieter the further I went, and the sun was falling lower in the sky by the time I finally saw the cabin through the trees. It was a small building made of rough, dark wood, with a steep roof and a single chimney. Smoke wasn't rising from it, but there was a woodpile stacked neatly beside the door, and a metal bucket by the side of the porch. The place looked as though it had been maintained, but no one had been there for a while. The windows were dusty, and I could see the faint outline of furniture inside through the glass. There was a small dirt path leading to the front door, and I parked the car and got out, the air immediately hitting me with that sharp, clean smell of pine and earth. It was quiet, too quiet. I pulled open the door and stepped inside. The cabin smelled of old wood and damp, with the faint scent of smoke lingering in the fireplace. There was a small living area, a few chairs, a table with chairs around it, a basic kitchen corner, and a tiny bathroom in the back. The place was clean, but it had that empty, untouched feeling, like someone had left in a hurry and never returned. I unpacked my bag, placed it on the bed in the small bedroom, and sat on the edge, looking around. The quiet was almost painful, the kind of quiet that made you notice every little sound. The wind brushing against the trees, a branch scratching the roof, a distant bird call. I wasn't used to it, and it made me feel exposed. By the time the sun had completely set, I had built a fire in the fireplace. I stacked wood carefully, struck a match, and watched as the flames slowly came to life. The cabin glowed in the warm light, but the shadows were long and dark, stretching across the walls and corners, and I felt a flicker of unease. I told myself it was normal. I was alone in the middle of nowhere. Unease was natural. I went to bed early, thinking the darkness outside would seem less intimidating once I was asleep. I didn't sleep well. Every creak of the cabin, every sound of wind in the trees, every rustle made me tense. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a sharp knocking sound. It was faint at first, but it became more insistent, more deliberate. My heart jumped, and I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The cabin was small, and I should have been able to hear if anyone was outside. But the knocking didn't stop. I told myself it was probably a branch hitting the wall, or the wind, or an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but the sound felt too precise, too rhythmic. I stayed in bed, frozen, listening. Then I heard it again, steps. Someone walking around the perimeter of the cabin. My pulse quickened, and I stayed very still, trying to think. The windows were dark. The forest outside was too dense to see anyone approaching unless they were right at the door. I debated calling the police, but there was no cell signal. My mind raced with options. I considered leaving immediately, running to the car, but the steps were slow, deliberate, circling around. Whoever it was, they were taking their time. Hours passed. I didn't sleep. I stayed in the corner of the room, with the fire dying down to embers, trying to keep as quiet as possible. Every tiny sound set my nerves on edge. I didn't know how long I stayed like that, but eventually, the sound stopped. I waited, but nothing moved outside. By the time morning came, the forest was calm, bright with sunlight, and I convinced myself that it had all been in my head. I left the bedroom and checked the windows. Nothing. No footprints in the dirt near the door. No signs of anyone. Maybe it had just been an animal. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone the night before. I spent the day exploring around the cabin, checking the nearby woods, making sure there were no trails or paths leading close to the windows. I even moved some rocks and dirt near the porch, just to see if anything had shifted during the night. Everything seemed normal. I tried to relax, chopping more wood for the fireplace, making sure the cabin felt safe. Then, on the second night, it happened again. This time, I was ready. I had set up the fire, stacked wood, and kept a large knife near the bed. Around midnight, I heard the first knock. I froze, listening, counting each sound. The knocking was deliberate, heavy, slow. And then came the steps again. This time, I could hear the crunch of dirt under boots. I didn't panic. I had to think clearly. I moved quietly to the door, pressed myself against the wall, and peered through a small crack in the window. There was someone outside. A man, tall, wearing a dark jacket and a hood, walking slowly around the cabin. He stopped at the edge of the porch, looked directly at the door, then walked around again. I could see a backpack on his back and a large flashlight in his hand. He wasn't making a sound, but the way he moved, deliberate and slow, made my stomach twist. I realized that he was scouting the place, trying to see if anyone was inside. He could have been a hiker, but there was something off about the way he lingered, circling, as though he knew I was there. I stayed in the corner again, waiting. I needed a plan. If he entered the cabin, I had to be ready. I remembered the small trapdoor under the kitchen table, a hatch to the cellar. The cabin had one, though it was more for storage than for safety. I grabbed a flashlight and the knife, slowly making my way to it. I opened the trapdoor just enough to slip down quietly, then pressed myself against the wall in the darkness below. I could hear him moving inside. He opened the door slowly, stepped into the cabin, and I could hear the floor creak under his boots. He was searching. He didn't have a gun, just the flashlight. I stayed absolutely still, barely breathing. He moved through the living area, shining the light around, checking every corner. I could hear him muttering under his breath, though I couldn't make out the words. He opened cabinets, looked under chairs, and then stopped near the bedroom. I held my breath, listening. After what felt like an eternity, he stepped back, circled once more, then left. I didn't hear the door slam. I didn't hear him run. I just waited, counting every second, until I felt sure he was gone. When the sun rose, I didn't wait. I packed my things quickly, leaving almost everything behind, except what I could carry in my car. I drove slowly down the dirt road, scanning the forest constantly. I didn't see him again, but I didn't care. I just needed to get to a place where there were people, where there was cell service, where I could feel safe. A few hours later, I stopped at a small gas station in a town far from the forest. I called the police, told them everything, and they came to take a report. They told me that someone had been reported missing in that area recently, a hiker who had been acting strangely. They suspected he had been wandering around the woods, breaking into cabins. It wasn't a ghost story. It wasn't something unreal. It was real, human, and dangerous. The fact that he had found the cabin before me, the fact that he had been so close, made me realize how vulnerable I had been. After that trip, I didn't go back to the woods for a long time. I took time to recover, to rebuild the sense of security I had lost. I started keeping better track of my surroundings, always checking cell signal, always making sure someone knew where I was. I realized that the quiet, the isolation I had wanted, could also be dangerous. Solitude in the woods isn't peaceful for everyone. For some, it's a trap. Months later, I returned to the same area, but only for a day hike, staying close to the main trails, in daylight and surrounded by other people. I never went back to the cabin. I knew it was still there, quiet, empty, waiting. I sometimes think about what would have happened if I hadn't been careful, if I hadn't found that trapdoor, if I had been careless or brave in the wrong way. The thought makes me shiver, but it also makes me appreciate the value of preparation, observation, and caution. The experience changed me. I learned that danger isn't always obvious. It doesn't wear a mask or appear in movies. Sometimes, it's just a person walking slowly in the dark, circling your cabin, testing your space, waiting for a mistake. I learned that fear is useful, that it sharpens your senses and forces you to think. I also learned that endings can be good if you act carefully and deliberately. I escaped because I paid attention, because I stayed calm under pressure, and because I used the small advantages I had: the trapdoor, the fire, my knowledge of the cabin. I never took that kind of solitude for granted again. I still enjoy the woods, still go hiking, still visit cabins, but I am never naive about isolation. I make plans, I prepare, I check my surroundings constantly. I make sure that if someone else is out there, I won't be an easy target. I learned to respect the forest, the silence, and the potential for human danger that can appear without warning. And I carry that lesson with me every time I step away from the city, every time I leave the familiar behind, into the unknown. I had planned the trip for months, imagining long walks in the woods, crisp air, and the quiet that comes from being far from towns and roads. The cabin I rented was small, old, but solid, tucked deep into a stretch of forest so dense that even during the day, the trees blocked most of the sunlight. I drove up the rough dirt road, feeling a mix of excitement and unease. The car rattled over roots and rocks, and the smell of wet earth filled the air as the tires sank slightly into mud left by last night's rain. When I finally reached the clearing where the cabin stood, I felt a strange silence settle over the place, the kind that made me hyper-aware of every sound my own movements made. The cabin itself was simple. Wooden walls darkened by age and weather, a small porch, a single window on the front, and a creaking door that protested when I opened it. Inside, it smelled of old wood, dampness, and a faint trace of mildew. There were a few pieces of furniture, a wooden table, a couple of chairs, a small bed, and a tiny stove. A pile of firewood was stacked in the corner. I dropped my bags and sat down for a moment, just listening. The wind rustled the branches outside, and I could hear distant birds calling to each other. That sound, though natural, felt sharp in the silence, as if the forest was holding its breath. I unpacked slowly, careful not to make too much noise. Everything I had brought was simple: clothes, a few canned foods, some water, a flashlight, batteries, and a small first aid kit. I set the stove to boil some water and arranged my things neatly. The routine of organizing made me feel calm, like preparing my space for a long stay could somehow protect me from the vast unknown outside. I knew I was alone, completely, and yet the feeling wasn't frightening. Yet, it was just strange, like standing at the edge of something that I couldn't see fully. By late afternoon, the sun was beginning to drop, and shadows crept across the cabin floor. I chopped some firewood and stacked it carefully, noting the sound of the axe biting into wet wood. Each strike echoed, harsh and deliberate, bouncing off the walls of the small cabin and into the forest outside. When I finished, I set a few logs in the stove and lit a fire, the flame sputtering to life with smoke curling lazily into the chimney. The warmth was comforting, the smell of burning wood oddly satisfying. I ate a small meal of beans and bread, then washed the dishes in a metal basin. Outside, the forest was darkening, the trees stretching tall and indistinct. The wind picked up, rattling leaves and branches in a rhythm that seemed almost too deliberate, almost too loud in the silence. Night came quickly. I sat by the fire with a blanket over my shoulders, the cabin illuminated only by the flickering light. I could hear the forest settling for the night, the rustle of animals moving, the occasional snap of a branch, the low, distant hum of insects. I thought I had prepared for this, but the darkness pressed in differently than I expected. It was thick, almost physical, filling the spaces outside the cabin walls, moving with the wind, and somehow alive in its quiet. My mind wandered, imagining what might be out there. A deer, a fox, maybe nothing at all. Yet the imagination has a way of filling the silence with shapes and sounds, and soon I felt like the cabin itself was a fragile barrier between me and the vast unknown outside. Around midnight, I was awakened by a sound. It was faint, but deliberate. A soft, scraping noise, almost like someone dragging something across the ground. I froze, my ears straining in the dark. The wind was still, the branches outside were motionless, and yet the sound continued, slow and methodical. My first thought was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a bear, moving near the cabin, sniffing, searching. But it didn't match anything I'd heard before. It was heavier, slower, more deliberate. I stayed very still, listening. The sound stopped suddenly, and I thought I had imagined it. My heart was pounding, adrenaline making my hands tremble. I convinced myself it was nothing, that I was safe behind the walls of the cabin. I went back to the fire, which had dwindled to embers, and sat there until my eyelids grew heavy again. The next day, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. I needed to feel control over the space, to remind myself that I could move through it safely. I walked slowly, taking note of the terrain, the forest thick with underbrush, a small stream to the north, fallen trees creating natural barriers. The sun was bright, and the shadows that had seemed so oppressive the night before were now clear and tangible. I felt foolish for being frightened. Nature was indifferent, I reminded myself. There were animals, yes, but no one was targeting me. Yet something about the way the forest felt, dense, layered, and deep, left a lingering sense of unease. It was as if moving through it required constant attention, careful steps, and constant vigilance. That night, the sounds returned. This time, more distinct, more structured. Scraping against the cabin walls, faint thuds near the porch. I stayed awake for hours, staring into the darkness beyond the window, trying to convince myself it was a branch brushing against the cabin. Some deer stepping carefully over the uneven ground, something mundane. But the pattern of the sounds didn't match anything natural I knew. It was too measured, too intentional. Every few minutes, a soft thump, then silence, then another thump, closer this time. My stomach knotted, and my hands gripped the edge of the table. I realized that no matter how carefully I had packed, no matter how many precautions I had taken, I was entirely vulnerable. The cabin, my shelter, was solid, but not impervious. If something wanted to break in, there was very little I could do to stop it. By the third day, I was barely sleeping. I kept the fire burning almost constantly, chopping wood to maintain a sense of purpose. My movements became methodical, almost obsessive, checking every lock, every window, every possible entry point. The scraping and thumping continued at night, sometimes fading, sometimes growing louder. I noticed signs outside that suggested I wasn't imagining it. Broken twigs, footprints in the mud that didn't match any animal I knew, marks that seemed deliberate. I realized then that someone or something had been watching the cabin for days, possibly longer. The thought was terrifying, because the forest's density made it easy for anyone to observe without being seen. I had assumed my isolation meant safety, but isolation also meant that any danger would have me completely exposed. I stayed vigilant, rationing food, and marking time by the sunlight and the fire's height. I didn't leave the cabin except for brief moments, always armed with the axe and a heavy flashlight. I avoided paths that could make me visible, sticking to areas close to the cabin where I could retreat quickly. Every night, the sounds became bolder, closer, heavier. I could no longer dismiss them as animals. Whoever it was had knowledge of my movements, of the cabin's layout, and possibly even my routine. It dawned on me that the danger was not random, not natural. It was deliberate and directed at me. On the fifth night, I heard movement on the porch, a distinct creak of the floorboards under weight. My hands gripped the axe, my body rigid. The fire had burned low, but enough light spilled to illuminate the outlines of the room. My mind raced. I had no phone signal. I was miles from the nearest neighbor. Every instinct screamed that I needed to defend myself, but I also realized the danger of making noise and alerting whoever was out there to my exact position. I stayed still, breath held, listening. Then came the faint sound of scraping against the door frame, as if someone was trying to test it. The door was old, heavy, but I could feel each scrape through the wood, each vibration reverberating under my hands. The fear was raw, palpable, every nerve screaming. I knew I couldn't stay passive forever. I spent the rest of the night preparing. I stacked heavy furniture against the door, placed sharpened tools within reach, and set the fire high enough to provide both light and warmth, though the warmth barely reached me. Sleep was impossible. Every sound, the wind, the trees, the distant water, made my heart leap. I could barely eat. My mind cycled through scenarios, all terrifying, imagining confrontation, hiding, escape, and the worst outcomes. The reality was simple. The forest had become a cage, the cabin both shelter and trap. By morning, the forest had fallen silent. I cautiously unblocked the door and stepped outside, axe in hand. The night had left its marks. Footprints, broken branches, disturbed earth, all evidence that someone had been close, maybe even inside the porch area. I decided it was time to leave. Packing quickly, I loaded the car with my belongings, keeping my eyes on the trees, scanning constantly. Every shadow seemed like it could conceal a person, every sound amplified in my mind. When I finally started the car and drove down the dirt road, the engine's rumble felt like a shield. My pulse was still racing, and I kept checking the rearview mirror. The forest remained still, seemingly indifferent, as if nothing had happened. But I knew the marks were there, hidden in the undergrowth, the evidence of a human presence that had observed me closely, patiently, for days. When I reached the main road and saw signs of civilization again, I felt a wave of relief that was almost overwhelming. I stopped at a gas station, sat in the car, and tried to process what had happened. I realized that the forest, the cabin, the isolation, all of it had been neutral. The danger had not been supernatural or imagined. It had been very real, human, and deliberate. That realization was terrifying, but also oddly clarifying. I knew I had survived because I remained calm enough to observe, prepare, and act when necessary. I had relied on nothing but my own senses, patience, and endurance. Later, I contacted the local authorities, and they investigated the area. They found signs of a squatter's camp, hidden deep in the woods, close enough to monitor the cabin without being detected. No one was caught, but the evidence confirmed what I had feared. The threat had been real, human, and calculated. The fear, the nights of terror, the sleepless vigilance, all were justified. But the most important thing was this: I had made it out unharmed. I had survived, clear-headed, and alive. That knowledge stayed with me, shaping how I viewed isolation and wilderness. I would never again take solitude for granted, but I had also learned that awareness, preparation, and calm reasoning could be the difference between survival and disaster. The cabin, the forest, and the nights of terror were behind me, but the lessons I learned would never leave. I had always liked the idea of being completely alone in the wilderness. There was something about the silence, the isolation, the way the world seemed to shrink down to the small space you occupied that appealed to me. I didn't want people, I didn't want distractions, and I didn't want noise. That's why, after months of planning, I found myself driving down a dirt road that barely looked like it had been used in years. My destination was a small cabin, a wooden structure built decades ago, tucked into a clearing in the middle of thick forest. It had no electricity and no running water. Just a wood stove, a small loft, and a few pieces of furniture that had been left behind by previous visitors. When I arrived, the sun was low, painting the treetops in gold, and the air was heavy with the smell of pine and damp earth. The cabin was smaller than I expected, but I liked that. A single room with a loft above, a table with a few chairs, and a rickety bed in the corner. I parked my car just outside, feeling the soft crunch of the gravel under my boots. I carried my backpack inside, and as I stepped across the threshold, the silence hit me fully. There was no sound of traffic, no distant voices, not even the chirping of birds, only the faint creak of the wooden floor beneath my feet. I dropped my bag, and for a moment, I just stood there, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light that filtered through the dirty windows. I spent the next hour unpacking, putting supplies in the small kitchen area, stacking firewood near the stove, checking my water supply. Everything was simple, everything was functional, and that simplicity made me feel calm. I built a fire in the stove, the first real crackle of sound in the cabin, and watched the smoke curl up the chimney. I ate a small dinner I had brought with me, and then settled down in the corner, wrapped in a blanket, watching the flames. Outside, the forest was darkening, shadows creeping between the trees, and the wind started to whisper through the branches. At first, it was comforting, like the forest was alive and breathing. Night came fast. I went to the loft to sleep, the mattress thin and hard, but warm under the heavy blanket I had brought. I fell asleep to the sound of the wind, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the distant call of an owl. But around midnight I woke suddenly. Something had shifted in the cabin. My chest tightened as I realized that the sound wasn't the wind or an owl. It was something else. A faint scraping, almost imperceptible, like someone dragging a boot across the wooden floor. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe a branch had fallen against the wall. Maybe it was an animal. But as I listened, the sound repeated, coming closer, slower, deliberate. I stayed still, heart hammering, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Then I heard it again, clearer this time. A low, dragging thump, moving toward the loft. I pressed my back to the wall, telling myself I was imagining it. Maybe I had left the door open and a raccoon had wandered in. I told myself I was overreacting, but my eyes, adjusted to the dark, picked up movement. A shadow flickered across the floor. Something big. Not human, not exactly, but large, with a shape that didn't belong in a cabin this small. I gripped the blanket tighter, trying to slow my breathing, listening. The sound stopped. Silence. I told myself to move, to grab my phone or flashlight, but the moment I shifted, I heard another noise. This one coming from the doorway below the loft. A slow, deliberate scraping, then a soft thump like a foot hitting the floor. My stomach dropped. I realized there was someone in the cabin. Not a ghost, not a figment of imagination. Someone human, someone moving through my space. My mind raced. The cabin was remote. No one would know I was here. I had told no one I was coming. How had they found me? I stayed frozen, listening as the intruder moved, slow and deliberate, checking corners, stepping lightly but with purpose. My options were limited. I could try to fight, but I had nothing more than a small pocket knife. I could run, but the only exit was down a narrow ladder into the main room, straight into whoever was there. Panic surged, but I forced myself to think. I had to survive this. I grabbed my flashlight quietly, turning it on for just a second to see. My heart jumped. At the far end of the cabin, a man crouched near the stove, his face hidden under a hood. He hadn't seen me. He was searching for something. I realized then that he wasn't interested in me. He was interested in supplies, maybe food, maybe equipment. Relief mixed with tension. But that relief vanished when he looked up, sensing movement. His eyes locked on mine, sharp and dangerous. He moved fast. I bolted, down the ladder, across the floor, knocking a chair over. He lunged, grabbing at me, and I twisted out of his grip, my hands raw on the rough wood. I ran for the door, heart pounding, boots hitting the dirt outside. The cold night air hit me, and I sprinted to my car, fumbling with the keys. He followed, shouting something I didn't understand. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and started the engine. I drove without looking back, dirt road flashing under headlights, branches scraping the sides of the car. The forest seemed endless, dark, and suffocating. Every shadow could hide him. I reached a paved road, the first sign of civilization in miles, and pulled over, trying to calm myself. I called the police, giving them the best directions I could, shaking, trying to make my voice steady. They told me they would send someone, but the nearest station was over 30 minutes away. I sat there, listening to the silence of the phone line after I hung up, realizing how alone I had truly been. By the time the police arrived, I had returned to the cabin with backup. They searched thoroughly, finding the man hiding in the woods near the cabin. He had a backpack filled with supplies he had stolen from other cabins in the area. He was arrested and I was safe. I spent the night at a friend's place nearby, unable to sleep, replaying the events over and over. In the days that followed, I returned to the cabin to collect my things. I noticed small things I hadn't before. Footprints around the perimeter, marks on the door frame where he had tried to pry it open, evidence that he had been watching, planning. I realized that while the encounter had been terrifying, it had also been a wake-up call. The wilderness was beautiful, isolating, and peaceful, but it could also be dangerous. I started carrying a firearm for protection, installed stronger locks, and made sure someone always knew where I was going. The forest remained quiet, the cabin unchanged, but I never forgot the sound of that scraping, the shadow moving in the dark, the feeling of someone being inside my space without warning. It taught me to respect the isolation, to be cautious, and to always prepare for the unexpected. I returned to the cabin many times after that, but I never let my guard down again. The wilderness had shown me its beauty, but it had also shown me its danger, and I learned to navigate both carefully. I had been driving all day, my car bouncing along the narrow, uneven forest roads that seemed to stretch endlessly into the mountains. I had been craving isolation, away from the noise and stress of the city, away from people, away from anything that demanded attention. I found the cabin online months ago, advertised as remote, private, and fully equipped. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, but a functioning wood stove, a small generator, and a well-stocked pantry. The idea of being completely alone for a few days was exactly what I needed, and I had planned every detail meticulously. When I finally arrived, the sun was dipping behind the trees, casting long, uneven shadows across the dirt path that led up to the cabin. The place was exactly as it had been pictured: small, wooden, rustic, and tucked between thick pines, with a narrow creek running nearby. The isolation was immediate. The nearest neighbor's house, if there even was one, was miles away. The silence was so dense I could hear the wind brushing against the tree trunks, the distant call of a bird, the water running over stones in the creek. I parked the car near the cabin and unloaded my gear. My backpack was heavy with supplies: food for 4 days, bottled water, a first aid kit, extra clothes, a flashlight, batteries, a small hand axe, and a thermos of coffee. I had deliberately left my phone in the car, knowing it wouldn't work out here anyway. I wanted to be cut off, forced to exist within the woods and the cabin alone, relying on myself. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of old wood and dust. The interior was small, with a single bedroom, a living area, a tiny kitchen, and a bathroom with a shower. The stove was the centerpiece of the room, a black metal thing that had been carefully maintained. There were firewood stacks neatly piled outside and a small generator tucked in a corner. I checked everything. The stove worked, the generator started, the windows locked. It felt good to know that this place was secure, that I could finally settle into quiet solitude. The first night was calm. I ate a simple dinner, lit the stove, and read from a book I had brought along. The darkness outside the cabin was intense, almost suffocating, but it was the kind of darkness I wanted. There was no light from cars, no distant city glow, nothing but the forest and the night. I went to bed early, but even in sleep, the unfamiliar sounds of the forest kept me half alert. I could hear branches snapping, the distant rustle of animals, maybe deer or raccoons, or something else entirely. It was unsettling, but also oddly comforting, like a reminder that I was alive, that the forest was alive. I woke the next morning to a sky filtered through the thick pine branches, sunlight slanting in golden streaks across the cabin floor. I made coffee on the stove and went for a short walk down the path that led to the creek. The air was sharp and cold, the kind that makes you feel every breath in your chest. The creek was shallow but clear, running over smooth stones. I filled my thermos and drank some, letting the water wake me fully. On the way back, I noticed something odd. A section of the trail near the creek looked disturbed, like someone had been there recently. Footprints maybe, but they were faint and irregular. I shrugged it off, assuming it was an animal. The forest was full of animals. That afternoon, while chopping firewood outside, I heard a loud crack from deeper in the forest. It wasn't like a branch breaking. It was sharper, more deliberate. I froze, scanning the tree line, but I couldn't see anything. My heart started to race. I told myself it was just an animal, probably a deer or a moose, and that there was nothing to worry about. But the sound lingered in my mind. Every rustle, every snapping twig seemed louder now, more intentional. As the sun set that day, a tension built inside me I hadn't expected. The forest changed with the fading light. Shadows deepened, and every movement seemed exaggerated. I made dinner quickly, piling logs on the stove to make the cabin feel warm and secure. Even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My mind raced with scenarios, each more paranoid than the last. I told myself repeatedly that no one else could have been in the forest. The cabin was isolated, but a part of me couldn't ignore the possibility. Night fell again. I lit every lamp and settled in with a blanket on the couch, trying to read, trying to distract myself. Then I heard it, a low crunch like heavy boots on dry leaves, somewhere just beyond the clearing around the cabin. My body froze. The sound came again, slower this time, closer. I realized with growing dread that whatever it was, It wasn't an animal. The steps were deliberate, uneven, careful. Someone or something was walking toward the cabin. I moved quietly to the bedroom, shutting and locking the door behind me. I grabbed the hand axe I had packed and pressed my back against the wall, listening. The steps paused. The silence that followed was almost unbearable, stretching seconds into what felt like minutes. Then the steps moved away, but I didn't move. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I stayed like that until I heard nothing but the wind in the trees and the creek running. The next morning, I found something alarming. On the porch, someone had been there overnight. The log pile was disturbed, footprints in the dirt leading up to the cabin and back into the forest. They were boot prints, large, with a deep tread. My first instinct was to leave, to drive back down the mountain and report it. But the road was miles away, and I had no cell service. I realized then just how isolated I truly was. I couldn't rely on anyone else. I spent the day reinforcing the cabin. I dragged extra logs close to the windows, wedged sticks in the door frames to make them harder to open, and kept my axe close at all times. I remained hyper-alert, jumping at every noise, scrutinizing every shadow. The forest, which had felt beautiful and serene just a day ago, now felt hostile and threatening. By the third night, the intrusions escalated. I could hear movement around the cabin throughout the night, twigs snapping, soft shuffling, the occasional low thud. Someone was circling, watching. I barely slept, taking shifts staying awake, peering through windows with a flashlight. At some point, I realized I needed a plan. Running was impossible without risking getting lost in the woods. Staying meant defending myself. I barricaded the doors more securely, lined the windows with heavy furniture, and prepared to fight if necessary. The following morning, I found evidence that terrified me further. The intruder had left marks on the cabin, scratches in the wood near a window, deep gouges on the porch railing. I searched the area and found other signs. Discarded wrappers, an empty can, a small, worn cloth that didn't belong to me. They had been here more than once, maybe even multiple nights. I realized this wasn't random. Someone was deliberately monitoring me, testing my presence. I stayed tense for 2 more days, rationing food, keeping the fire burning constantly, and never letting my guard down. Every movement outside made me jump. I avoided going near the tree line without checking my surroundings multiple times. I couldn't call for help, couldn't leave, and couldn't ignore the danger. But gradually, the person or people seemed to lose interest. Maybe they had realized I was vigilant. Maybe they were waiting for another opportunity. I didn't know. The fear never fully lifted, but the constant proximity and noise faded. On the 5th morning, I decided I couldn't remain trapped any longer. I packed quickly, leaving only the bare minimum behind, and prepared to descend the mountain. I chose the path I had driven in on, knowing it was longer but safer. The forest was quiet, almost peaceful compared to the previous nights, but I didn't trust it. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, made my stomach knot. I kept the axe in one hand and my backpack in the other, moving as fast as I could without running and drawing attention. By late afternoon, I saw the first signs of civilization. Telephone poles, the glimmer of the road through the trees. My relief was immense, physical, almost overwhelming. I reached the main road, flagged down a passing car, and made it back to town. I reported the cabin and the intrusions to the local authorities. They assured me they would check the property, though they admitted remote areas were difficult to monitor. In the following weeks, I learned from the authorities that there had been reports of people using remote cabins to hide and watch others, waiting for opportunities to steal or attack. My cabin had been one of several targets in the region. They reinforced the importance of vigilance, even in places that seemed completely isolated. The experience changed me. I still crave solitude sometimes, but I am hyper-aware of the risks now. I plan every trip meticulously, check local reports, and always have multiple layers of safety. And I learned, in the most visceral way possible, that the forest is never just peaceful. It can be silent and beautiful, but it can also hide someone watching, waiting, and testing your vigilance. I still go hiking and stay in cabins, but I no longer take isolation for granted. Every creak of wood, every rustle in the trees, every shadow in the corner of my eye reminds me to respect the reality of being alone, and that survival isn't just about the wilderness. It's about staying aware, alert, and prepared for the very real dangers humans can bring. I had been planning this trip for months. The idea was simple: escape the noise of the city, spend a week alone in the woods, disconnect from everything, and just exist. No phone signal, no internet, no one around for miles, just me and the forest. The cabin I rented was small, rustic, and deep in the woods. It had no electricity except for a small solar panel on the roof, no running water, just a small well, and a fireplace that was meant to provide heat. I had seen pictures online, and it looked perfect, isolated enough to get the peace I craved, but not so far that I would be completely trapped if something went wrong. The drive to the cabin had been long. The last 20 miles were on a dirt road that twisted and turned between towering pines. The road was narrow, and in some places it looked like it hadn't been traveled in years. I kept thinking about the warnings from the website: be careful in bad weather, and don't come at night. I had left early in the morning, and by mid-afternoon I finally arrived. The cabin was smaller than I expected, but cozy. A wooden structure, slightly weathered, with a tin roof and a stone chimney. It was surrounded on all sides by thick forest, and the sound of birds and the wind through the trees was the only thing I could hear. I parked my car beside the cabin and stepped out. The air was cold, crisp, and smelled faintly of wet earth and pine needles. The kind of smell that makes you feel awake in a way the city never does. I opened the cabin door, which creaked loudly as it swung open, and stepped inside. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight coming through the small windows. The interior was simple: a small kitchen area with a counter and a tiny sink, a table with 2 chairs, a small sofa, and a loft bedroom above. There was a wood-burning stove, a bucket for water, and shelves lined with canned goods left by the previous owner. After unpacking my bag, I decided to explore the surrounding area. The forest was thick, the trees tall and close together. There were narrow paths that looked like deer trails winding through the woods, but nothing that seemed like a maintained trail for hikers. As I walked, I noticed how quiet it was. Really quiet. Not the kind of quiet where you just hear yourself think, but the kind where everything feels muted, like the world itself is holding its breath. Occasionally, a branch snapped under my foot or the distant call of a crow broke the silence, but mostly it was still, and I realized how unused I was to this kind of absolute isolation. The sun was setting when I returned to the cabin. I built a fire in the stove and boiled water for tea. I sat in the dim light of the cabin, the shadows of the fire flickering on the wooden walls, feeling a strange mixture of peace and unease. There was nothing here that should have made me nervous. No one could get here easily, and yet, the deeper I went into this isolation, the more aware I became of how alone I truly was. That night, I slept fitfully. The wind through the trees sounded louder than I expected, and at times, the cabin creaked in ways that made me sit up suddenly, heart racing. But I reminded myself that it was normal. Wood expands and contracts, branches scrape against the walls, animals wander near the cabin at night. Nothing to fear. The next morning, I decided to take a longer walk. I wanted to explore the forest, find a stream or a pond, maybe even a hill with a good view. I packed a small bag with water, a sandwich, and my map, and set off. I walked for hours. The forest was dense, and every turn seemed to look the same as the last. I realized quickly that without clear landmarks, it was easy to lose your sense of direction. I tried to memorize my path as I went, marking trees with small scratches and moving sticks to mark turns. Eventually, I found a small creek, the water clear and cold. I knelt beside it and drank, feeling the icy water shock my system awake. I explored further upstream, noticing signs of wildlife, tracks of deer, scat from smaller animals, claw marks on tree trunks. The forest was alive in ways I hadn't thought about before. As the afternoon passed, I realized I had been walking longer than I intended. I turned back toward the cabin, but soon it became clear that I was disoriented. Trees, paths, and the contours of the land all looked the same. My scratches on trees didn't help much. The markings were faint, and in some areas, the forest was so dense that I couldn't even see the creek where I had started. Panic started to creep in. I wasn't prepared for this. I didn't have a compass, and my phone had no signal. I tried to retrace my steps, but every turn seemed wrong. The sun was dropping low, and shadows stretched long and strange between the trees. By the time darkness fell, I had no idea where I was. I could barely see, the forest turning into an almost solid wall of black. I remembered the emergency flashlight in my bag and fumbled for it. The weak beam barely penetrated the darkness, illuminating twisted roots and thick underbrush. I kept walking, hoping to stumble upon something familiar, any sign of the cabin. My heart was racing, my mind running through every mistake I had made. I had underestimated the forest, underestimated isolation, underestimated how quickly calm could turn into fear. Hours passed, or maybe it was only 1 hour, I couldn't tell. My legs ached, and I was starting to feel the chill of the night creeping through my clothes. I found a small clearing and decided I had no choice but to stop. I built a small fire with twigs and dry leaves I found, not knowing if it would be enough to keep me warm all night. The firelight cast long, dancing shadows, and every noise in the forest sounded amplified. The rustle of leaves, a distant snapping of a branch, the flapping of wings. My mind kept playing tricks, making me think something was moving just beyond the light. I reminded myself, over and over, that there was nothing out here that could hurt me. Just forest, just me. Morning came, and with it, a thin, cold light that barely penetrated the thick canopy. I was stiff, hungry, and exhausted, but I was alive. I decided to change my approach. Instead of wandering, I would try to follow the creek. Water usually leads to civilization, I reasoned. I spent the entire day trudging along, careful to keep the sun at my back so I could keep track of direction. I ate the small amount of food I had left, drank sparingly from the creek, and tried to stay calm. By evening, I started noticing signs of human presence. Faint tire tracks on a muddy path, a piece of broken fence. My hope rose. I continued, following these faint signs, and by nightfall, I finally saw something unmistakable in the distance. The roof of my cabin, partially hidden behind trees. Relief hit me so hard I almost fell to my knees. I ran the last few 100 meters, stumbling, cutting myself on branches, my body screaming from exhaustion, but I didn't care. I reached the cabin, locked the door behind me, and collapsed inside. I sat by the fireplace, warming my hands over the embers, shaking, and overwhelmed by the contrast between my terror in the forest and the strange comfort of the cabin walls. Over the next few days, I stayed close to the cabin. I explored only the immediate surroundings, making sure to mark clear paths. I gathered firewood, organized the supplies, and forced myself to eat and drink properly. Each day, I forced myself to confront the fear that had taken hold the previous night, reminding myself that the forest itself was not dangerous. My unpreparedness had been the danger. Slowly, I regained a sense of calm. By the time the week was over, I had developed a respect for the forest that went beyond fear. I learned how to identify edible plants, how to track the sun for navigation, how to read the subtle signs of wildlife. I learned how quickly isolation could twist your perception, and how important preparation and respect for your environment really are. When I finally left, I packed the car and looked back at the cabin one last time. The forest was quiet and still, indifferent to my presence. I realized that the fear I had felt was real, but it was also a lesson. I had survived because I stayed calm, adapted, and kept moving. There was nothing supernatural, nothing magical, nothing outside the natural world that had threatened me. Just the forest and my own mistakes. Driving back, I thought about how easy it is to underestimate nature, to think you are in control when, in reality, it can humble you in an instant. I had planned for a simple escape, but I returned with something more valuable. A sense of awareness, a respect for the power of isolation, and the knowledge that even in moments of fear, clarity and survival come from patience, observation, and perseverance. The cabin, the forest, and that terrifying night had changed me in ways I would never forget. I remember the first time I saw the cabin. Deep in the woods, I felt a kind of strange excitement mixed with unease. It was late October, the air crisp and cold, the kind of chill that made your lungs burn with every breath. I had been driving for hours along narrow, winding roads that seemed to disappear into the thick forest. My phone had no signal, and the GPS on my car had stopped updating miles back. I didn't mind at first. I liked the idea of being cut off. A weekend alone, away from the city, away from the constant noise and pressure of work, seemed perfect. The cabin was tucked into a small clearing, surrounded by tall pine and oak trees that blocked most of the weak autumn sunlight. It was older, made of dark logs that had started to gray with age, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle. There was a small wooden porch with a railing missing a few slats, and the windows were grimy, clouded with dust and leaves pressed against the glass. A thin trail of smoke rose lazily from the stone chimney. Someone had been here recently. I didn't see anyone around, but the cabin seemed alive in some subtle way, like it had been waiting for me. I parked my car on a patch of flattened grass and took my backpack, feeling the weight of the supplies I had brought. I had packed food for 3 days, bottled water, a first aid kit, a flashlight, extra batteries, a small camping stove, and a few blankets. I also had my pocket knife and a hunting knife strapped to my belt. I wasn't the kind of person to go unprepared. I had spent plenty of weekends hiking in the mountains and camping in the wilderness, but this place felt different. It had an emptiness about it, a silence that was almost too deep, like the woods had swallowed all sound. The door creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood, old smoke, and a faint, sour odor that I couldn't identify. The floor was wooden planks, slightly uneven, and there were cobwebs in the corners. Dust lay thick on every surface, but the furniture was still in decent condition. A small table, a couple of chairs, a worn sofa, and a few shelves with old, moth-eaten blankets and some rusty cookware. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, the hearth blackened from long-unused fires. I set my backpack down and ran my hands along the edges of the furniture, feeling the roughness of the wood. I spent the first hour exploring the cabin and the area immediately around it. There was a small stream nearby, the water clear and cold, running over smooth rocks. I filled a bottle with it, knowing I could boil it later for drinking. Behind the cabin, the forest thickened quickly, trees growing close together, their branches tangled like fingers. I found a faint trail leading deeper into the woods, but it was overgrown and seemed to have been unused for years. The sun was starting to dip low, and shadows stretched across the ground. I decided I would not venture far. I wanted to stay close to the cabin. I built a small fire in the fireplace using dry kindling I found stacked in a corner. The flames flickered and crackled, warming the room slightly, and I sat on the sofa, eating a sandwich I had packed. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, sending branches scraping against each other. For a moment, it was peaceful. I leaned back and closed my eyes, listening to the forest. But then I noticed something, a faint sound, almost imperceptible, like footsteps on dry leaves. I froze, straining to hear. The steps didn't continue. They stopped as soon as I did. I thought it must be an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. The forest was full of them. I tried to shake the feeling of unease and told myself I was being paranoid. After all, I was alone. The sound couldn't have been anything human. Night fell quickly. The temperature dropped sharply, and the cabin felt colder than it had all day. I piled blankets over myself and tried to sleep on the sofa, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every creak of the floor, every groan of the wood, sounded louder than it should. I kept my knife close, just in case, though I knew I probably wouldn't need it. I finally dozed off for a couple of hours, only to be awakened by the sound of something scratching at the back door. I sat up, my heart hammering in my chest. The scratching stopped as soon as I moved, and I held my breath, listening. The forest outside was quiet again, but my stomach twisted with tension. I got up slowly, picking up the flashlight from the table, and crept to the back door. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the small clearing behind the cabin. There was nothing there, no animal, no person. just leaves scattered across the ground and the shadows of the trees swaying in the wind. I felt my hands shake as I locked the door. I spent the rest of the night in a half-sleep, waking every hour to check the doors and windows. At some point, I heard it again. Footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just waited. Eventually, the noises faded, replaced by the sound of the wind in the trees. When morning finally came, I was exhausted, my body aching from tension and lack of sleep. I decided I couldn't stay inside all day. I needed to check the perimeter of the cabin, see if there was any sign of who or what had been moving around last night. I stepped outside, the cold biting at my face. The forest seemed almost peaceful in the daylight, but I felt exposed, vulnerable. As I walked around the cabin, I noticed footprints in the damp soil near the back door. They were large, human, and fresh. They led away from the cabin into the woods. Panic rose in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. Someone had been here, someone who had watched me. I scanned the trees, looking for movement, but there was none. I went back inside and packed a small bag with essentials: water, food, knife, flashlight, and a lighter. I decided I would leave, take the trail back to the main road. But first, I wanted to see where the footprints led. I followed the trail carefully, keeping my senses alert. The footprints twisted through the woods, occasionally doubling back, sometimes disappearing into underbrush, only to reappear a few meters later. I felt like I was being watched, and the forest around me seemed to close in. The sunlight dimmed as the canopy thickened, and shadows lengthened unnaturally. I had the sense that I wasn't just following the footprints. Someone was following me too. Hours passed as I moved slowly through the trees. My legs were tired, my hands scraped from branches, and my heart constantly leapt at every sound. I reached a small clearing where the footprints ended abruptly. There was no sign of a person, just a small, makeshift campsite. An old tarp, some ashes in a fire pit, and empty food wrappers. It looked abandoned for at least a few weeks, but the footprints matched the size and shape of the ones near the cabin. Whoever had been here had a way of disappearing without a trace. I decided to head back, not wanting to linger. On the way, I noticed something else. Rocks piled unnaturally, almost like markers. I tried to ignore it, focusing on getting back to the cabin, but my stomach sank as I realized the forest itself seemed designed to confuse. Trails twisted back on themselves, trees and undergrowth blocked straightforward paths, and I kept getting turned around. Panic began to take hold. I felt trapped. I spent the rest of the day trying to retrace my steps, but it was impossible. Every landmark I remembered looked different in the shifting afternoon light. I realized that if I didn't find a way out before dark, I would be completely lost. I tried to remain calm, forcing myself to mark trees with scratches, tie pieces of cloth to branches, anything to make sure I could find my way back. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I knew I had to prepare for another night in the forest. I returned to the cabin as quickly as I could, praying it was still there. To my relief, it was. The door was locked, the windows intact. I ran inside, exhausted, and started a fire in the fireplace. I ate as much as I could and wrapped myself in blankets. I stayed awake almost the entire night, listening, alert for any sign of movement outside. But this time, the footsteps didn't come. The next morning, I realized I had no choice. I couldn't stay in the cabin forever, but I also couldn't risk trying to follow the same trail through the forest. I needed to make a plan. I decided to follow the stream I had found on the first day. Water sources usually led to roads or settlements. I packed my things, checked my knife, flashlight, and lighter, and headed toward the stream. The water was freezing, but I drank carefully, and I kept moving, stepping carefully on slippery rocks, avoiding the undergrowth. Hours passed. My legs ached. My clothes were soaked from crossing shallow sections of the stream, and I was hungry, but I kept going. Eventually, I started seeing signs of human presence. Discarded cans, a faint trail worn into the earth. My hope rose slightly, then I heard it again. Footsteps, deliberate, slow, coming from deeper in the forest, away from the stream. I froze, my blood running cold. Whoever it was, they weren't far. I debated hiding, but I knew the forest offered no cover I could trust. I moved faster, keeping low, following the stream, until finally I heard the faint sound of a road in the distance. I ran toward it, the sound of tires and engines growing louder. Soon, I emerged onto a narrow dirt road, and a car appeared around a bend. I waved frantically, and the driver stopped. I ran to the vehicle, trembling, soaked, and covered in mud and scratches. The driver didn't ask questions. They gave me a blanket and some water. I sat in the seat, exhausted and shaking, as the car took me back to the main highway. When I finally reached safety, I called the local authorities. They searched the area around the cabin but found no one. There were no signs of forced entry or habitation, aside from the small campsite I had seen. They told me the forest was vast, with very few people venturing that far, and it was easy for someone to remain hidden. They also warned me to be careful in the future. I agreed. I didn't want to go back. In the days that followed, I tried to process what had happened. I realized the fear, the isolation, and the unknown presence in the forest had taken a toll on me. But I also felt a strange relief, a sense of accomplishment that I had survived. I had trusted my instincts, stayed calm under pressure, and made it out alive. The memory of those footsteps, circling, patient and silent, would haunt me for a long time, but I knew I had faced the fear and endured. The cabin itself remained a mystery. Who had been there? How long had they been watching? I would never know. But I learned something important about the forest, about solitude, and about myself. Fear could be a powerful teacher, but courage and careful thinking could carry you through even the darkest, most uncertain nights. I never went back to that area, but I kept the memory as a reminder. Preparation, awareness, and perseverance were what kept me alive. I still dream about that forest sometimes, about the shadows moving just beyond the edge of the clearing, about the footsteps that never stopped. But I no longer feel powerless in those dreams. I know I can survive. I know I can endure. And that knowledge, hard-earned and unshakable, is worth more than any fear the forest could ever hold. I had been planning this cabin trip for months. It was supposed to be a solitary escape, a break from the noise of the city, the endless chatter of people, and the constant pressure of work. The cabin I rented was in a remote part of the mountains, far from any town or even small clusters of houses. The directions I received were simple on paper, but in reality, the last few miles were nothing more than a dirt track barely wide enough for a car. I had a map, a compass, and a GPS, but I liked the thought of being truly alone, relying on nothing but my own senses and preparation. When I arrived, the sun was just beginning to dip behind the peaks, casting long shadows over the forest. The cabin itself was small, made entirely of timber, with a sloping roof and a chimney that had clearly not been used in some time. The smell of aged wood and damp pine immediately hit me as I stepped inside. It was quiet in a way that was almost unnatural. There was no hum of electricity, no distant sounds of traffic or neighbors, just the faint rustle of leaves outside and the creaking of the cabin settling into its foundations. I spent the first hour walking through the small cabin, inspecting every corner. The floorboards creaked under my weight. There were no furnishings beyond the basics. A small kitchen area with a stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a simple bed in a separate room. The windows were large and looked out into the dense forest. I could see the orange glow of the sunset through them, and the forest beyond seemed calm, almost inviting. I unpacked my things slowly, placing them neatly on the table and in the tiny closet, making sure everything was in order. By the time I was done, the sun had disappeared completely, leaving the forest outside in shadows that seemed to shift and breathe with every gust of wind. I built a small fire in the stove and sat on the edge of the bed, eating a simple meal I had brought with me. It was strange, this quiet, the kind of quiet that felt almost heavy, pressing down in the chest. I was alone, truly alone, and yet it felt like the cabin was aware of me. Every small sound, From the drip of water from the leaky roof to the faint scratching of branches against the walls, was magnified in the silence. The first night passed without incident. I slept fitfully, waking at odd hours to the sound of the wind rattling the cabin. I would sit up, listening carefully, straining to distinguish between the ordinary noises of nature and anything unusual. By morning, the sun filtered through the windows and the forest looked completely different, as though the shadows of the night had been hiding its true form. The second day was spent exploring the immediate surroundings. I had hiked along a small trail that led down a slope toward a creek. The water was clear and cold, and I could see fish darting in the shallow pools. I marked my path carefully, noting trees and rocks that could guide me back. I wanted to ensure that I could return to the cabin without getting lost, because the forest was dense and easy to get disoriented in. The forest itself was alive with noise during the day. Birds calling to one another, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, and the constant whisper of wind through the trees. But even in the daylight, there was a sense of being watched. Not by anything human, but by the forest itself. Every movement in the corner of my vision seemed to vanish when I turned to look. That night, I stayed up later than usual. I had brought a notebook, and I wrote down every detail of the day. The way the sunlight fell on the creek, the sound of the water, the shapes of the trees. I wanted to record everything because I had a feeling that the forest would look different the next day, and I wanted to remember it as it was. Around midnight, I heard something unusual. A crunching sound outside, like boots on gravel, but the path to the cabin was covered in leaves, not gravel. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I stayed very still, listening, and the sound stopped as abruptly as it had started. I assumed it must have been a deer or some other animal, but the pattern of the steps had sounded deliberate, human almost, and I could not shake the feeling of being observed. The next morning, I inspected the cabin thoroughly. Nothing seemed out of place. The door was locked, the windows were secure, and there were no footprints outside. I tried to dismiss the incident, telling myself it was a trick of my imagination. But as the day went on, I noticed small things that unsettled me. A branch that had fallen against the window that I was sure had not been there before, a rock that seemed out of place near the door, and faint scratches on the wooden siding that I had not noticed the day before. They were small details, almost imperceptible, but they made me uneasy. I began to wonder if I had truly been alone. I spent that day doing more exploration, hiking along a ridge that gave a clear view of the surrounding valley. From there, I could see other small cabins scattered in the distance, though none seemed close enough to be accessible on foot. I felt a brief sense of relief at the thought that, if necessary, I could hike to one of them and find help. But then I remembered that the forest was vast, and even a short distance could take hours to cover, especially if I had to move quietly or avoid detection. As night fell again, the wind picked up. It blew through the trees with a force that rattled the cabin and caused the shadows outside to dance across the walls. I built a larger fire in the stove and sat close to it, watching the flames. I felt the weight of isolation pressing on me. I could hear the forest clearly now. The snap of twigs, the rustle of leaves, and faint sounds that I could not identify. My imagination began to play tricks on me. Every shadow seemed to hold movement. Every sound seemed purposeful, directed toward me. It was during this night that I realized I was being watched. Not just a vague feeling, but a concrete sense that someone or something was keeping track of my movements. I could hear faint sounds outside the cabin, like someone walking just beyond the tree line. The wind made it difficult to pinpoint, but the pattern was deliberate. I could hear pauses, slow steps, and sometimes a sudden stop, as though the watcher was trying not to be heard. I did not sleep that night. I stayed awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, watching the windows and the dark forest beyond. My fire had dwindled to embers, but I kept adding small logs, the light flickering across the room, trying to keep some sense of safety. The following morning, I found clear footprints around the cabin. They were human and they were fresh. They circled the cabin once, then disappeared into the forest. I felt a wave of panic but forced myself to stay calm. I checked my supplies, packed a bag with essentials, food, water, a flashlight, a knife, and decided to stay inside as much as possible. I barricaded the doors and windows as best I could using furniture and boards I found in a small storage closet. The realization that someone had been watching me closely, perhaps even for hours, made my stomach churn. Over the next day, I did not leave the cabin. I kept watch from the windows, scanning the forest in all directions. I could see signs of movement, broken branches, flattened grass, and occasionally the faint figure of someone in the distance, always keeping just beyond clear sight. I considered hiking out, but the forest was dense, and I knew I could be intercepted. I decided to wait for the person or people to leave and to stay as quiet and hidden as possible. The nights that followed were the worst. I stayed awake most of the time, fire at my side, eyes glued to the windows. The presence outside was constant. I could hear footsteps at irregular intervals, twigs snapping, and the faint scraping of something against the cabin walls. The fear was physical. A tightness in my chest, cold sweat, nausea. I began to ration food carefully because I did not know how long I would need to stay inside, and I refused to make any noise that could give away my position. It was on the fourth night that I finally realized what was happening. This was not a random act. Someone had been tracking me, studying the cabin, and possibly waiting for me to make a mistake. I began to notice subtle signs. A pattern in the placement of objects outside, faint markings on the trees that seemed to guide movements, and small traps, like sticks placed to make noise if disturbed. Whoever it was, they were methodical and patient. The thought terrified me, but it also gave me a plan. Patience could work in my favor too. I spent the next day preparing. I collected supplies, made a clear path to the back door of the cabin where the forest was densest, and set small markers that would allow me to track the approach of anyone trying to follow. I used the knowledge I had gained over the previous days of observing patterns to my advantage. I knew that the watchers expected me to be afraid, to make a rash move. I had to stay calm and deliberate. That night, I waited until the footsteps resumed, circling the cabin. I could hear the rhythm, the stop-and-go pattern, the faint shifting of leaves under the weight of boots. When the steps moved away slightly, I slipped quietly out the back door, staying low to the ground. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to move steadily. I followed the markers I had set, keeping an irregular pace to avoid being predictable. The forest was dark, but I knew the path well enough from my previous exploration. Hours passed as I navigated the forest, avoiding areas I knew had been watched or trapped. The cold seeped into my bones, but I kept moving, driven by the need to survive. Finally, as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I stumbled onto a dirt road. My relief was overwhelming. I followed the road until I reached a small ranger station. I found people there, told them everything, and they listened carefully. They organized a team to return to the cabin and investigate. Later, I learned that the cabin had been the site of a long-running criminal surveillance operation. The people who had been watching me were trespassers who had been using abandoned cabins in the forest to monitor visitors and target them. They had been caught before I could encounter them directly, thanks to the timing of my escape and the ranger intervention. I stayed at the ranger station for several days, recovering and making reports. The sense of relief was profound, but it was mixed with lingering fear and disbelief that such meticulous, patient danger had existed so close, unnoticed. I realized how easy it was to be observed without knowing it, how the forest that seemed peaceful and quiet could hide something entirely different. When I finally left the mountains and returned to the city, I carried with me a heightened sense of awareness, a caution that was both physical and psychological. I knew that I had survived because of patience, observation, and preparation, but I also knew that luck had played a role. I never went back to that cabin, nor did I take such solitude lightly again. Every time I look at a forest from a distance, I feel the weight of those nights, the stillness of the cabin, and the faint, deliberate steps that had kept me trapped in fear. Survival had been the result of careful planning, calm thinking, and a refusal to panic. I realized that in such situations, fear is not the enemy. It is the tool that can be turned against you. By maintaining control over my own mind and movements, I escaped unharmed. The ending was clear. I had left the forest alive, and the danger that had lurked so close was caught and neutralized. I would never forget the experience, but I also knew that I had emerged stronger, wiser, and more aware of the hidden realities of isolation. Even now, years later, I can recall every detail: the smell of the cabin, the way the firelight flickered against the walls, the sound of footsteps in the forest, and the absolute silence of the night. I can still picture the forest outside, its shadows stretching long and dark, and I remember the cold, methodical patience of someone watching, waiting. And I remember the relief, the overwhelming clarity of escaping danger, and the realization that awareness, preparation, and calm thinking were the only tools that truly mattered in the face of real, tangible fear. I had always been drawn to the idea of escaping into the wilderness, of leaving the city behind and immersing myself in the quiet, isolated life that a cabin in the woods could provide. I had spent months researching small cabins in remote areas, checking maps, looking at satellite images, reading local forums, and planning a trip that would let me be completely alone for a week. The cabin I finally found was a small wooden structure, off a dirt road that itself branched off a barely maintained forest trail. From the photos, it looked rustic but solid, with a little porch, a small stone chimney, and a couple of windows that seemed to catch the morning light just right. The reviews mentioned that it was very private, and most people had no issues. I thought I had found the perfect escape. The drive there took longer than I expected. Even with my small car, the dirt roads were rough, winding through dense forests and crossing a few streams. There were no street signs, and I had to rely on the GPS coordinates the owner had sent me. At times, the GPS signal would drop, and I would have to stop and check the map on my phone, making sure I hadn't taken a wrong turn. By the time I finally reached the last stretch, the sun was dipping low, and the forest around me was a dark green wall, tall and dense. The air was crisp and carried the faint scent of pine and damp earth. It felt both peaceful and slightly oppressive, the kind of peace that has a quiet edge of danger because of its remoteness. I parked in front of the cabin, noting that the driveway was overgrown and that the grass and weeds had claimed much of the space. The cabin itself looked as isolated as it had online, sitting in a small clearing with forest all around it. I unlocked the door with the key the owner had left in the mailbox, and the smell hit me immediately. A mix of wood, old dust, and faint mildew. It wasn't unpleasant, just real. I set my backpack on the floor, took a deep breath, and started inspecting the place. The cabin had a main room with a small kitchen area and a wood-burning stove. There was a bed against the far wall, a small bathroom, and a loft above the kitchen. Everything was functional, if a little worn. The place had been empty for a while, I could tell. There were cobwebs in the corners, a thin layer of dust on the surfaces, and the faint creak of the wooden floor under my weight. I spent the first hour unpacking and getting the cabin ready for the week. I stacked firewood near the stove, made sure my flashlight had fresh batteries, and checked that my phone and power bank were working. I had brought plenty of food, water, and a first aid kit. I was being careful, meticulous even, because the isolation of this place meant I had to rely on myself for everything. Once I felt like I had everything in order, I stepped out onto the porch to watch the sunset. The sky was streaked with pink and orange, and the forest seemed to glow in the last light. I felt a strange mixture of calm and tension. Calm because I was finally here, alone and free, and tension because I knew that in this kind of isolation, the slightest misstep could become dangerous. Night came quickly. Once the sun set, the forest transformed. The temperature dropped sharply, and the shadows thickened. I lit the wood stove, letting the fire warm the cabin, and spent the evening sitting on the floor near it, writing in my notebook, making lists, and just watching the flames. The silence was complete, except for the occasional sound of an animal moving outside, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a small branch. There were no human sounds, no cars, no distant voices, nothing. The kind of silence that feels like it's holding its breath. It was around midnight when I first noticed the sound outside. First, I thought it was the wind. The trees swayed, their branches scratching against each other and the cabin. But then I realized that this was different. It was a soft, deliberate crunching sound, like someone or something was walking carefully through the underbrush, not far from the cabin. My heart rate quickened, and I froze, listening. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. I told myself it was probably a deer, a raccoon, or some other animal. Still, I felt uneasy. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, made sure the lights outside were off so I wouldn't attract attention, and tried to go back to sleep. But the sound returned intermittently throughout the night, always moving around the cabin, never in a straight path, always careful, slow, deliberate. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I woke up, I strained to listen, waiting for another sound. The next morning, I decided to explore the immediate area around the cabin, just to make sure there was nothing or no one lingering nearby. I walked in a circle around the clearing, paying attention to the tracks in the dirt. I saw animal tracks, deer mostly, and a few small raccoon or rabbit prints, but nothing human. I started to feel a little better, telling myself that the noises must have been animals. Still, I made a mental note to keep a close eye on the surroundings and to be cautious when moving through the woods alone. The days passed with a mix of uneventful isolation and subtle, unnerving tension. I gathered firewood, explored further along the old trails, and spent hours just sitting and observing. Each night, though, the sounds came back. Sometimes it was footsteps outside, soft and careful. Sometimes it was the snap of branches. Sometimes a low rustle in the leaves that made me freeze in place. I never saw anyone, never caught a glimpse through the windows, but I felt the presence of something moving, just out of reach of my sight. I began keeping a small hatchet near the door, and I made sure the fire was lit before sunset. My phone signal was weak, sometimes non-existent, so I couldn't even call for help unless I walked to the higher part of the trail during the day. Around the fourth day, the situation escalated. I had gone down a narrow trail to look at a small stream, taking my camera to photograph the landscape. The trail was quiet, almost peaceful, until I noticed that the footprints I had been ignoring were there in the soft dirt. Human footprints. They were fresh, small, like someone had walked through in the last few hours. Panic set in, and I quickly retraced my steps to the cabin. I kept my eyes open, scanning the shadows between the trees. When I got back, I locked the cabin and reinforced the windows with wooden planks I had found inside. I realized that I wasn't just imagining things anymore. Someone had been in the woods near my cabin, following or watching, and I had no idea who or why. That night, I barely slept. I sat by the stove, keeping the hatchet close, and listened. The sounds outside were louder, more deliberate. I could hear crunching in the dirt, the snap of branches, moving in circles around the cabin. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow past the window. My stomach twisted. I thought about the option of leaving, but the roads were rough, and it was dark and raining lightly. I decided to wait until morning. I had to get out safely. By dawn, I had a plan. I would pack my things quickly, take only what I needed, and make my way back to the main road where I could get a signal and call for help. I moved as quietly as possible, the rain making the dirt slippery and the forest even darker. As I reached my car, I noticed footprints leading up to it. Someone had been there during the night. They hadn't touched my car, but they had left their presence, and I could feel the eyes on me, even as I hurried inside. My hands shook as I started the engine. The rain had turned the dirt road into a slick, muddy path, and I drove slowly, careful not to get stuck. The journey back was tense. Every rustle in the forest, every snapping branch made me jump. I kept scanning the sides of the road, expecting to see someone following, but there was nothing. The isolation that had felt peaceful before now felt suffocating, oppressive. After hours of careful driving over the rough terrain, I finally reached a paved road and found a small gas station with a phone signal. I called the local authorities and reported the situation. They said they would send someone to check the area, but it was late, and I needed to stay somewhere safe for the night. I rented a small motel room, exhausted, tense, and still shaken. The next day, law enforcement checked the cabin. They found evidence of someone else having been there recently. Footprints, disturbed dirt, some marks on the porch, but no one was caught. They suggested the person may have been a hunter, a local, or someone who used the cabin illegally. It was impossible to know. I felt relief at leaving, but I also realized that the wilderness I had romanticized had a side I hadn't considered. The side where isolation can make you vulnerable and every sound can feel like a threat. In the end, I learned a few things that stuck with me. Preparation is critical, but sometimes it's not enough. Awareness and caution are essential, especially when you're alone. The forest is beautiful, but it is also unpredictable, and human threats can be just as real as natural ones. I returned to the city, shaken, but grateful. I didn't need to experience the woods to find adventure again. I realized some adventures are best observed from a safe distance. Looking back, I can picture the cabin clearly. The small clearing surrounded by thick trees, the wooden structure with its weathered walls, the sound of the wind mixing with the quiet steps outside. That week in the cabin changed the way I think about solitude, about safety, and about the real risks of being alone in the wilderness. I never went back, and I never will, but I remember it in detail, every moment etched into my mind. A lesson in vigilance and respect for the untamed world. I had been planning this trip for months, a solo retreat into the woods to get away from everything. Work had worn me down, city noise had eaten into my thoughts, and I just needed silence. I found a small cabin for rent online, far out in a forested area where cell service was spotty at best, and no one would bother me. The pictures showed a rustic wooden cabin tucked between tall pine trees, with a small lake not too far away. The owner mentioned it had electricity, a wood stove, and enough supplies to last a week. That was all I needed. I packed carefully, bringing food, water, blankets, and a basic first aid kit. I also brought a large flashlight, a couple of knives, and a small hatchet. I had no intention of running into trouble, but I wanted to be ready. The drive was long and quiet. As I left the highway, the roads narrowed into dirt trails that twisted between hills and thick stands of trees. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low in the sky, casting a soft orange glow over everything. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, and the silence was deep, almost heavy. When I pulled up, I noticed that the cabin looked just as it did online, maybe even more isolated than I had expected. The wood siding was weathered, and the roof had some moss, but the structure was solid. I carried my bags inside, noting the simplicity of the cabin. There was a small kitchen with a stove, a living area with a few chairs and a table, and a lofted bedroom above. A stack of firewood sat neatly near the stove, and there were enough blankets to last the week. The first night, I made a small fire, boiled water, and cooked some pasta. I sat by the fire, watching the light flicker against the walls. The wind whispered through the trees outside, and for a moment, I felt completely alone. I didn't mind the silence, it was the point, but there was a strange tension in the stillness. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle in the branches, sounded louder than it should. I went to bed early, falling asleep to the low hum of wind and distant animal sounds. The next day, I explored the area around the cabin. The forest was dense, the ground uneven with roots and rocks, and the trees thick enough that sunlight barely touched the forest floor. I found the lake, a small, mirror-like body of water surrounded by reeds. The water was clear, but something about it felt quiet in a way that was almost unnatural. I spent the day walking along the edges, taking photos, marking small trails with stones in case I wanted to find my way back. I felt good being outside, being alone, being in control of my own pace. That night, I noticed sounds I hadn't before. There were knocks, faint at first, that seemed to come from the trees or the cabin itself. I brushed it off as branches moving in the wind or maybe small animals. I checked the locks and went to bed, but sleep came in short bursts, interrupted by every small sound. At one point, I woke to the feeling that someone or something was outside watching. My stomach tightened, and I stayed very still, holding the flashlight. Nothing moved, and after a long while, I forced myself to sleep again. The following morning, I realized my food supply had shifted. Not a lot, but just enough to make me notice. I chalked it up to maybe the way I had placed it. As the day went on, I explored more trails. There were old logging paths, some partially overgrown, and occasional signs of wildlife. I spotted deer tracks, and farther down, large animal prints I didn't recognize. I made mental notes of their direction, careful not to wander too far. Still, a small unease had begun to build inside me. The forest felt quieter in some parts, almost like it was holding its breath. By the third night, the tension had grown. The wind picked up, rattling the roof and shaking branches against the cabin walls. Every small sound outside made me jump. Around midnight, I heard something move very close to the cabin, deliberate and heavy. I grabbed the hatchet and flashlight, creeping to the door and shining the beam around. The forest was dark, and the trees cast huge shadows in the light. At first, I thought it was a deer or a moose, but the movements were different. Slow, careful, and unnervingly quiet. I stayed inside and sat by the fire, watching for hours, but nothing emerged. Sleep didn't come. The next morning, I went outside with more caution than before. There were tracks around the cabin. Human tracks. They were large, and they circled the cabin, stopping and starting in odd places. My stomach dropped. Whoever or whatever had been out there was watching, and I hadn't even realized it. I spent the day gathering firewood closer to the cabin and checking the perimeter. I considered leaving, but I had driven hours to get here, and I had no cell service to call for help. The nearest town was miles away, and the road back was rough. As the days went on, the presence outside the cabin grew more obvious. Items I left outside for just a moment were moved or rearranged. Sometimes I would step outside and see footprints that weren't there the day before. One morning, I found a rock thrown through the cabin window, not breaking it but leaving a mark. Panic started to set in, but I forced myself to remain logical. Whoever it was, they were nearby and I was alone. I reinforced the windows and doors, placed more firewood around as barricades, and slept near the fireplace with my hatchet close. By the 5th day, I had made a routine. I stayed mostly inside, only going out for essential supplies like water from the lake. I noticed strange smells outside, burning leaves, dirt, faint smoke, and sometimes the sound of distant footsteps or branches snapping. The sense of being watched never left. I kept reminding myself to stay calm and think rationally. People hike in forests all the time, and wildlife makes noises that can be alarming. But deep down, I knew this was different. On the 6th day, the tension finally snapped. I had gone to collect water from the lake, carrying a large jug. As I returned to the cabin, I saw someone standing among the trees, barely visible, but unmistakably human. My heart stopped. I froze, holding my breath, the jug in my hand. The figure didn't move, just stared. I realized I had to get inside the cabin fast. I sprinted the last few yards, slamming the door and locking it, heart pounding, sweat soaking my clothes. I barricaded the door further with furniture and prepared for the night. Every shadow in the cabin felt alive. Every creak made me flinch. I spent hours planning, examining the exits, making sure I had a path if I had to run. I found an old hunting rifle in the cabin's corner, dusty but functional, and cleaned it as best I could. I kept the flashlight in one hand and the rifle in the other, scanning every sound outside. I slept in short bursts, waking at every noise. The presence outside never left. The turning point came on the 7th day. I was checking the perimeter through a small window when I saw the figure again, moving closer to the cabin. This time I was ready. I realized they weren't alone. Another figure was behind them. They were surveying the cabin carefully, like they were waiting for something. I knew I couldn't stay inside any longer. I grabbed my backpack with essentials, left the cabin through the back door I had cleared, and ran toward the logging path I had marked days before. I kept low, moved quietly, and kept my flashlight dim. The figures didn't chase immediately, but I could hear them moving among the trees. I ran until the path twisted into a steep slope, covered in thick underbrush. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I didn't stop. I had a mental map of the nearest main road from my exploration earlier. After hours of careful movement, avoiding open areas and keeping to the shadows, I finally reached the road. I hid in the trees until a car drove by, then ran into the light, waving my arms. The driver stopped, shocked, but I didn't care. I explained my situation as best I could while trying not to panic. They drove me to the nearest town, where I called the authorities. The police returned with me to the cabin the next day. The area had signs of someone living in the forest nearby, makeshift shelters, fire pits, and supplies. They told me that people sometimes hide in these woods for weeks, avoiding detection. They had been tracking similar cases for months, and I had been lucky to escape without a direct confrontation. The cabin was abandoned after that, and I never went back. Even weeks later, I could still feel the tension of those days. The isolation, the constant watching, the fear of being trapped. It stayed with me. I had planned a peaceful retreat and instead found myself in a situation that was frighteningly real. I learned that the forest is not just beautiful and quiet, it can be unpredictable, and the people who use it to hide are a danger you might never see until it's almost too late. Now, every time I think about that cabin, I remember the exact smell of the pine, the weight of silence, and the shadowy figures watching. I remember the cold fear in my chest when I ran through the underbrush, the sharp fear that I might not make it. And I also remember the relief, the first time I saw a car on the road and knew I was safe. It took weeks to feel normal again, but that experience taught me to respect the isolation and to prepare for the worst, even when I expect the best. I drove down the winding mountain road in the late afternoon, the sunlight slanting through the tall pine trees in thin, golden streaks. The air was crisp, sharp with the cold that comes just before winter really sets in. I hadn't been in the mountains for years, not like this, alone in my own car, heading toward a cabin I had rented for the weekend. It was supposed to be simple. A few days away from the city, away from everything, a chance to read, hike, and just breathe. The idea was relaxing at first, but by the time I left the main highway and turned onto the smaller gravel roads, something in me had shifted. The quiet was heavier than I expected. Not peaceful exactly, heavy, dense. Like the trees themselves were leaning closer to watch me as I passed. The GPS on my phone wavered in and out, signal weak and unsteady, forcing me to rely on the printed directions the cabin owner had sent me. Every so often, I passed a rusted mailbox or an abandoned house that looked like it had been empty for decades. The deeper I drove, the thinner the air seemed, colder, drier, and the trees so thick I could hardly see the sky. When I finally arrived at the gravel clearing where the cabin sat, the sun had begun to sink behind the mountains, and the sky was painted in shades of purple and dark orange. The cabin was older than I expected, with dark wooden planks that had weathered to gray, and the roof sagging slightly in the middle. There was a small porch with a single chair, worn and cracked. The windows reflected the dying light, and I couldn't see inside. I parked my car beside the cabin and stepped out, the crunch of gravel under my boots loud in the stillness. The air smelled faintly of pine and damp earth, and a chill ran down my spine. I grabbed my bag and opened the door. The inside smelled of dust and old wood. A faint mildew smell mixed with the lingering scent of smoke from a fireplace that clearly hadn't been used in a long time. The cabin was small, just a living area, a kitchenette, a bedroom and a bathroom, but cozy in its own way. I set my bag down, ran my hands over the rough wooden table, and tried to imagine myself enjoying the weekend. The silence was overwhelming. Not the kind of silence you get in a quiet room in the city. This was deep, unbroken, stretching into the forest outside the cabin. I spent the next hour unpacking, setting out the small stove and lanterns I had brought, and stacking firewood beside the fireplace. By the time I finished, the sun had disappeared completely, leaving the forest in darkness, though the moon was high and full, casting a faint silver light across the clearing. I lit the fireplace, the kindling crackling loudly in the quiet room, and sat down in the single chair by the fire, letting the warmth spread through my fingers. I thought about going to sleep early, but I didn't feel tired yet. That's when I first noticed it, the sound. Faint, almost imperceptible at first. A scraping, dragging sound outside, near the edge of the clearing. I froze, listening. My heart started beating faster. It was slow, deliberate, not like an animal, not like the wind. I couldn't see anything from the cabin windows. The fire was the only thing keeping the darkness at bay, and even then, the shadows beyond the clearing seemed thick, pressing against the edges of the light. I told myself it was probably a fallen branch, or maybe some kind of deer dragging something. I tried to ignore it, but then, minutes later, it happened again, closer this time. A sharp crack of wood breaking, followed by the dragging sound. Slow, heavy, deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out onto the porch, the cool night air biting at my cheeks. I swept the beam across the clearing, the forest, the surrounding hillside. Nothing. No animal, no person, no movement beyond the waving of the pines in the wind. My pulse was fast now, almost painful in my chest. I stayed on the porch for several minutes, shining the light around, ears straining for the slightest noise. Finally, when nothing happened, I went back inside, locking the door behind me. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid. The first night passed slowly. Every small sound made me jump. A branch scratching against the roof, leaves brushing against the cabin walls, the faint howl of a distant coyote. I kept the fire going as long as I could, sitting in the chair with my legs pulled up, ears straining. Eventually, exhaustion overtook my fear, and I fell asleep in the chair with the fire low. The next morning, the forest seemed different, quieter, but the unease lingered. I went outside to explore, walking the perimeter of the clearing. I found tracks in the soft mud near the edge of the forest, large, human-like, but dragging something heavy. My stomach tightened as I traced them with my eyes. They didn't match mine, not a caribou or bear, and I didn't think they belonged to anyone who lived around here. The tracks led from the trees to the edge of the clearing, then disappeared into the woods on the far side. I shivered. I tried to convince myself that it was probably just a hunter or someone who had passed through, but the dragging mark worried me. It was too deliberate, too careful, not like someone just walking through the woods. That afternoon, I tried to distract myself by hiking a nearby trail I had seen on the map. The hike was beautiful at first, sun filtering through the trees, crisp air, the sound of a small creek nearby. But as I climbed higher, the forest seemed to close in, twisting the trail in ways that made it feel like I was walking in circles. I kept checking my phone's GPS, but the signal was spotty. Eventually, I turned back, taking a slower route down the hill, trying to enjoy the scenery. When I returned to the cabin, the sun was already low. I set my pack down and noticed something I hadn't before. On the porch, near the edge of the clearing, was a faint mark on the ground. A circle roughly scratched into the dirt, like someone had knelt and dragged something around carefully, deliberately. My stomach turned. I scanned the forest around me. The same dark, unbroken line of trees, but nothing moved. That night, I didn't even try to sleep in the chair. I moved my bedroll onto the floor in the corner, keeping the fire going as long as possible. Every sound outside, the scraping, the rustling, the faint cracking of branches, made my heart pound. I couldn't see anything, but I knew I wasn't alone. Not in the cabin exactly, but in the forest surrounding it. I told myself over and over that it was probably just an animal. But the tracks, the marks on the ground, the dragging sound, it didn't fit. No animal behaved like that. On the third day, I woke early. The fire had burned down to embers, and the air was frigid. I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I had to leave. I packed quickly, checking the cabin one last time. That's when I noticed the door, slightly ajar, even though I had locked it the night before. Panic hit me, sharp and sudden. I stepped outside, scanning the clearing. There were footprints now, dozens of them circling the cabin, some leading toward the woods, some toward my car. They were large, heavy, almost like someone had stomped around, testing the perimeter. And there, near the base of a tree, was something new. A log dragged and placed upright, balancing in a crude, almost deliberate formation. I ran to my car, threw my bag in the trunk, locked the doors, and started the engine. The tracks around the cabin were everywhere now, the clearing a web of them, but no one in sight. My hands shook as I drove, eyes darting to the trees. Every so often, I thought I saw movement just beyond the road, something crouched, watching. The forest closed in tighter, darker, like it was swallowing the road behind me. The drive down the mountain was tense, every sound in the car amplified. The gravel crunched under my tires, the engine hummed, my pulse thudding. Every shadow in the trees looked like a figure waiting, following. I didn't slow, didn't glance back. By the time I hit the main highway, sunlight was starting to rise, scattering the shadows and giving the forest back its ordinary appearance. I stopped at the nearest gas station, hands still shaking. I filled the tank, bought coffee, and called the cabin rental office. They were shocked when I described the tracks and the marks. They told me the cabin was supposed to be private, but there had been reports recently of squatters in the area. Men who would live in abandoned cabins, watch the few visitors, and sometimes, when someone came alone, follow them around the property. Nothing supernatural, nothing unreal, just people. Dangerous, careful, patient people. When I returned home, I went straight to my apartment, double-locking every door, checking every window. I stayed awake for 2 nights, replaying every sound, every step. The forest, the cabin, the tracks. It never left me. But I told myself I was safe now. I had left, had returned to civilization. I had survived. I had avoided whatever or whoever had been in that clearing. I never went back. Not to that cabin, not to the mountains alone. I learned to respect the weight of silence, the density of isolation. I learned that fear isn't always about ghosts or monsters. It's about being watched, being followed, being alone in a place where help isn't coming. And I learned to listen to the small sounds that warn you when something is wrong, even when you want to ignore them. I drove out of the small town before dawn, the roads empty and slick from a light rain that had fallen overnight. The forest stretched out on both sides of the road, dark and silent, trees slick with moisture, their trunks rising like silent sentinels. I hadn't been to this cabin in nearly a decade, not since I was younger and came with my father for a weekend trip. He had passed away a few years back, and inheriting this place felt like reclaiming a fragment of my past. I wanted solitude, a chance to be away from people, phones, and the constant pressure of life. The cabin sat in a clearing, deep in a state forest, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that had become almost overgrown. When I finally reached it, the tires of my truck crunching over loose gravel, I stopped and looked at it. The place hadn't changed much, at least from the outside. The wooden siding was weathered, darkened by rain and sun, and the roof sagged slightly at one corner. Moss had crept along the edges, and the stone chimney looked aged but intact. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, fresh but heavy with the lingering smell of decay from fallen leaves. I opened the front door, which creaked like it always had, and stepped inside. Dust motes floated in the streams of morning light filtering through the grimy windows. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and I instinctively checked the lock on the back door. Everything was exactly as I remembered, except for the faint smell of mildew that had settled into the corners of the rooms over the years. I left my bags in the small entryway and walked through the cabin slowly, inspecting the rooms. The living area had an old stone fireplace, a sagging sofa, and a couple of chairs, all covered in a thin layer of dust. I could see cobwebs in the corners, and the smell of dampness was stronger near the kitchen. I had come prepared. I unpacked food, water, and firewood, then set about cleaning the cabin as best I could. I scrubbed the counters, swept the floors, and opened all the windows to air the place out. The wind stirred the treetops outside, and I realized how completely isolated this cabin was. There were no neighboring houses visible, no power lines, no roads other than the one I had driven in on. Just the forest stretching for miles in every direction. I felt a thrill in the solitude, but there was also an undercurrent of unease that I couldn't shake. The forest wasn't alive in the way towns were. It was vast, indifferent, and impossible to predict. That first night, I lit a fire in the fireplace. The flames crackled and cast shadows across the room, stretching the corners into strange shapes. I had a lantern and extra batteries, but I liked the firelight. I felt secure in the way people feel secure when surrounded by walls. Yet outside, the forest was full of hidden movement. Animals rustled in the undergrowth, and branches tapped against the cabin from time to time. I had brought a knife for emergencies, a first aid kit, and a small flashlight. I told myself it was precaution, not paranoia. I slept lightly, waking often to the sounds outside. There were deer and smaller animals, probably raccoons or foxes, and at some point a low, distant howl that I could not identify. In the middle of the night, I woke to the sensation of being watched, that prickling awareness of movement beyond sight. I lay still, straining to hear, and eventually the noise settled back into normal forest sounds. Still, the feeling lingered, a subtle tension under my skin that made me alert. The next day, I decided to explore the surroundings. I walked along a small creek behind the cabin, noting the fallen logs, rocks slick with moss, and the way the sunlight barely penetrated the thick canopy of pines and oaks. The isolation was profound. No birdsong interrupted the soft sound of water over stones. I found a small clearing with a log I could sit on and eat some food, feeling the kind of peace that only comes from being completely alone. But even then, I noticed the strange things about deep forests. The way shadows seem to shift just at the edge of vision, the odd bends in trees that look almost deliberate, as though something unseen had passed through. I shook the thought away. That night, I cooked over the fire again, making a small stew with vegetables and canned beans. The smell filled the cabin, a contrast to the musty, damp odor that had been lingering. I felt a sense of accomplishment in maintaining a self-sufficient routine, chopping wood, cooking food, keeping clean water stored. I could feel the rhythm of survival settling over me, a connection to a slower, quieter life. But then the noises started. At first, it was small things. Footsteps on the porch in the early hours, rustling in the brush close to the cabin. I convinced myself it was deer or raccoons, maybe a fox hunting. I checked the locks, shined my flashlight around the perimeter, and found nothing. But the noises persisted, becoming more deliberate, almost like someone circling the cabin. On the third night, it escalated. I was sitting near the fire when I heard a loud snap outside, like someone stepping on a branch right near the cabin. My heart jumped. I grabbed the flashlight and peered through the windows. Nothing. The forest was still, the shadows moving only with the firelight. I went outside cautiously, the beam of my flashlight sweeping across trees and brush. I walked around the perimeter of the cabin, knife in hand, calling out, though I knew there would be no answer. There was nothing, no footprints in the mud, no sign of human presence, just the trees, dark and endless. I decided to reinforce the doors and windows. I wedged a chair under the doorknob, stacked firewood against the windows. My rational mind told me that the forest had a way of playing tricks, that my imagination was heightened by isolation. But deep down, I felt a growing fear that was hard to name, a sense of being targeted, observed. I slept with the knife under my pillow, flashlight in reach, and every sound made me tense. The following day, I ventured further into the forest. I tried to rationalize my fear by staying busy, mapping the area, noting landmarks. I found a small pond several hundred meters from the cabin, surrounded by dense brush. I saw tracks along the muddy edge. Deer, maybe a coyote, and footprints that didn't match anything I recognized. They were human-sized, booted, and pressed deep into the wet soil. My stomach turned. The prints led to the pond and then veered back toward the trees. My mind raced. Hunters, poachers, squatters. I had no idea, but it was clear I wasn't alone in the forest anymore. I returned to the cabin and spent hours checking the locks, barricading the windows. The forest was unnervingly quiet that evening, the usual rustling subdued, as though the animals knew someone or something was out there. I built the fire high and stayed near it, knife ready. The hours crawled by. Around midnight, I heard it. A deliberate, heavy footstep on the porch. Someone was there outside, waiting. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, listening as the steps moved along the perimeter, slow, careful, methodical. I realized I couldn't wait for morning. I packed a small bag with essentials: water, food, a lighter, my knife, and the flashlight. I left the cabin through the back door, trying to be quiet, sticking to the shadows, moving toward the dirt road I had come in on. My plan was simple: get to the main road, find help, and not look back. The walk through the forest was tense. Every crack of a branch under my feet sounded like an alarm. I kept low, using the trees for cover, listening to the sounds behind me. After what felt like an eternity, I broke through the tree line and spotted the familiar stretch of dirt road. Relief surged. I ran, boots sinking into mud, until I reached the truck. The keys were in my pocket, hands shaking as I unlocked the door. I started the engine, the headlights cutting through the pre-dawn fog, and drove without stopping for miles. Eventually, I reached a small gas station and called the local sheriff. They came to check the cabin later. They found no one there, no footprints near the house besides mine, and no sign of forced entry. They speculated I might have frightened off whoever had been lurking, but the uncertainty lingered. They advised me not to return alone, and I realized they were right. I never stayed in the cabin again. Months later, I sold it to a local who had better knowledge of the area and experience with isolated properties. Looking back, I understand what had made it terrifying wasn't a ghost or a legend. It was isolation, vulnerability, and the simple fact that someone else could have been there, watching, for reasons I would never know. I learned to respect the power of being alone in the forest and the importance of preparation. My fear had been real, but so was my escape. I had survived, and that clarity gave me a strange sense of strength. Even now, when I think about that cabin, I remember the smell of wet pine needles, the sound of distant rustling at night, and the feeling of my own heartbeat in a dark room. I remember the fear, sharp and vivid, but also the calm after survival, the understanding that I could protect myself, trust my instincts, and leave when danger became real. That cabin taught me more than any city experience ever could, about self-reliance, caution, and the thin line between solitude and peril. I keep that lesson with me, and even when I return to the forest for short hikes or camping, I carry it as a guide, a reminder of what it means to survive when no one else can help you. I remember the day I first decided to spend a week alone in that cabin. It wasn't one of those flashy tourist cabins. It was old, built from heavy, rough-cut logs, sitting deep in the forest, far from any main road. I found it listed on a small, obscure site that specialized in private rentals. The pictures were basic, showing the cabin from a distance, a small porch, a stack of firewood, and a view of the forest stretching endlessly behind it. What drew me to it was the promise of complete isolation. The idea of escaping the endless noise of the city and finding a quiet week of nothing but the forest and me. I told myself I could handle solitude, but I had no idea what was waiting for me. The drive up was longer than I expected. The main road ended, and a rough gravel path wound into the trees, twisting and turning in ways that made my small rental car groan. The air changed as I drove, cooler, heavier, scented with damp earth and pine. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. The forest swallowed the light, and long shadows stretched across the clearing. The cabin stood just as it had in the photos, rustic and unwelcoming, surrounded by thick trees that seemed to crowd in on it. There was a narrow dirt clearing for parking, enough for one car and nothing else. The first thing I noticed stepping out of the car was how quiet it was. No birds, no insects, nothing. The kind of quiet that presses in on you and makes every small sound feel magnified. I carried my bags up to the porch, and each step of the wooden boards creaked under my weight. The door was heavy but not locked, the old iron latch catching as I lifted it. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and a faint, musty odor that told me it hadn't seen regular use in months. Dust lay thick on the floorboards, and the furniture was sparse. One table, a couple of chairs, a small bed with a threadbare mattress. There was a wood stove in the corner and a stack of firewood beside it. A small pile of newspapers lay in the corner, yellowed and brittle, remnants of who knew when. I spent the first hour unpacking and trying to make the place feel like mine. I stacked the firewood neatly by the stove, checked that I had enough food for the week, and made a mental note to start the fire before nightfall. The sun disappeared completely, and the cabin was plunged into darkness. I lit the stove and hungered for the warmth it provided. Shadows danced along the walls, exaggerated by the flickering light, and every noise from outside. The wind brushing against the trees, a branch snapping somewhere in the distance, made me jump. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just the forest, just the night settling in. I had brought a small lamp, but I resisted using it, wanting to adjust to the darkness, wanting to feel the isolation fully. As I settled in with a simple dinner, I noticed how utterly silent it was beyond the thin walls. There was no hum of electricity, no distant car sounds, no voices, just a complete, pressing silence. I thought I could handle it. I thought I could appreciate it. But there was a point where silence stops feeling like peace and starts feeling like a presence. Not a person, not a ghost, but a weight. The kind of weight that sits on your chest and makes your own thoughts feel loud. That night, I slept fitfully. Every creak of the floorboards woke me. Every groan of the cabin in the wind made me sit up. Around 2 in the morning, I was sure I heard something moving outside. I froze, straining my ears. There it was again, soft, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. Not the wind, not an animal. Something heavier, something moving on 2 legs. My first instinct was to convince myself it was a deer or some small animal, maybe a bear. But the rhythm of the steps was too steady, too deliberate. I didn't leave the bed. I didn't want to know if someone was outside. I kept my eyes on the small window beside the bed, barely daring to breathe. I had brought a small pocket knife just in case, and I held it under the pillow. The steps stopped at one point, and for a long moment the cabin was silent again. My heart was hammering so loud I thought it would give me away. I stayed that way until morning, when the sunlight streaming through the window finally allowed me to convince myself I had imagined it. The following day, I spent it in what I told myself was productive work. I chopped firewood, collected water from the nearby stream, cleaned the cabin, and explored the small clearing. Every so often, I would hear sounds, branches breaking, leaves rustling, but I attributed them to the wind or wildlife. Still, there was a nagging feeling that I wasn't alone. By the 3rd night, I knew for certain someone had been outside. I didn't see them, but I noticed signs. Footprints in the mud near the edge of the clearing, faint scuff marks near the door where the earth had been disturbed, and small twigs broken as though something had brushed against them deliberately. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a hunter, someone living off the grid, maybe a neighbor who had a right to be there. But the more I thought about it, the less convincing it became. I was isolated, miles from the nearest road, and the prints circled the cabin with an intent that didn't feel random. I started sleeping with the knife in my hand and the stove fire burning all night. Every noise was amplified in the darkness. Every shadow seemed to move in unnatural ways. On the 4th day, I found a large log from the cabin's porch had been moved. I was certain it hadn't been like that before. The wind? I doubted it. The log was heavy, and the ground around it showed signs of disturbance, as if someone had lifted it deliberately. Panic started to creep in. I wasn't imagining the footsteps anymore. I wasn't imagining the log being moved. Someone had been in my cabin while I slept. Someone watching, waiting. I spent the next 2 days preparing. I gathered every heavy object I could find, barricaded the windows as best I could with furniture and logs, and devised a plan to escape if necessary. I left small notes for myself on scraps of paper, reminders of what to do, in case panic overtook me. I kept a fire burning in the stove, partly for warmth, partly because I knew the light and smoke might signal to anyone outside that I was awake and alert. That night, the footsteps returned, louder, closer. They circled the cabin 3 times, then stopped. I could hear the faint scrape of metal against wood. Someone was trying the door. I held the knife, crouched low, my entire body shaking. Minutes passed. The silence that followed was worse than any noise could have been. Then I heard a low, almost inaudible sigh, and the footsteps retreated. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay. I couldn't risk another night of that terror. I packed everything in a frenzy, not caring about order, just the need to get out. I left the cabin as quickly as possible, my heart in my throat, every snap of a branch underfoot setting me on edge. The drive back to the main road was tense. I kept the doors locked, windows up, and eyes on every shadow. I didn't see anyone, but the thought that someone had been so close, so patient, kept me alert. When I finally reached a gas station, the sense of relief hit me like a wave. I sat in the car for a long time before I could even bring myself to move, listening to the normal hum of traffic, the distant voices, the constant noise that once I had thought of as irritating. I realized then that I had underestimated the intensity of isolation, the vulnerability it brings. That cabin, that forest, the total absence of civilization, it wasn't peaceful. It was dangerous in ways I hadn't anticipated. I returned home that day, exhausted and on edge. I didn't sleep for days, and even weeks later, the sound of a branch snapping or a creak in the floor would make me flinch. I never went back to that cabin, and I never looked for isolation in the same way again. The experience taught me that solitude is not always calm, that the forest can be a perfect hiding place for anyone with intent, and that fear is not about the supernatural. It is about the very real dangers that can find you when you are utterly alone. Even now, years later, when I drive past a quiet forest road, I feel the weight of that cabin pressing down, and I remember every footstep, every shadow, and every moment of silence that was louder than anything I have ever heard. I survived, and that is the only ending that matters. But the memory of that week stays, clear and vivid, a reminder that even the most peaceful places can hide the darkest threats when you are alone.